operating covertly and below current criminal thresholds. Is it her view that the current criminal thresholds have to change? And then finally, she talks of making rules around foreign money tougher. What about the millions of pounds of donations received by political parties, particularly the Conservative Party, from unincorporated associations, a type of body which the Committee on Standards in Public Life warned was a route for foreign money to influence UK elections? Will that be stopped, Mr Speaker?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There are a number of points there, but if I may, first of all, on legislation, because the right honourable gentleman has asked about when legislation, of course, that is when parliamentary time allows, and there is specific work taking place on the development of that legislation in the way in which I've spoken about. There are many, many aspects in particular to cover. He also touched on the Russia report. I refer him to the comments that I made earlier on. But he has also touched on some of the economic elements of malign activity and influence in particular. And I think it's fair to say the security alert that was issued on Thursday last week pointed quite specifically to the type of activity that's taken place in relation to lower criminal thresholds. We're going to change the laws to ensure that we can look at those thresholds. That is important work that takes place. But there is no doubt that foreign influence manifests itself in many, many ways, economic, through our institutions, and it's not just Parliament, and some of the institutions are well documented too, but also through dirty money, and that has been a long-running issue that absolutely needs to be addressed.
Sir Robert Butler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It would seem that for some of us, the old adage, beware of Greeks bearing gifts, doesn't seem to be well understood. And the sad truth is that from time to time this has happened in our House. But looking to the future, in welcoming my right honourable friend's statement, would she agree with me that not only is it incumbent upon the government through its new legislation to deal with the criminal threshold issue that she mentions, but also working with the House authorities to make sure that the granting of passes and the funding of APPGs and all those subtle but insidious and increasingly brazen attempts to influence members are stamped out for good?
Right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I thank him for his support, but also not just now, but also when he was in government as well, on these very, very issues, on thresholds in particular. And of course, Mr Speaker, the alert last Thursday was issued in conjunction with the Parliamentary Security Directorate, and there is work that we will provide support on in terms of vetting, security. It is right that we all come together, not just across law enforcement, with the intelligence services as well, to ensure that we close down any gaps that have been exploited by those who want to do us harm.
We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Home Secretary has been very robust in defending the government's response to the ISC's report on Russia. I just wondered, in light of recent events, whether she's had an opportunity to review the clear recommendations in that report, particularly pertaining to the Palace of Westminster and what we need to do.
Well, first of all, let me just welcome the new Chair of the Select Committee and congratulate her on her election. There is no question that every time, and I should be very clear about this, we learn all the time in terms of gaps and not just new threats, but the type of tactics and techniques that are used by those that want to do us harm. It is right that we review absolutely every single facet of security here. I come back to my earlier point about protecting democracy from malign interests, and of course, working with the Cabinet Office in particular who oversee this, that is effectively what we are doing.
Shreen Duncan-Smith.
Mr Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, and of course it's shocking that any member of this House should allow themselves to be used by a foreign power. But one of the problems we've got is this is not suddenly emerging. We have now a real problem with China. There are over 13 organisations hell-bent on that purpose, hiding in public view, working with the United Front and other organisations to report back to China. We know there are 4 people that we've failed to sanction, that the Americans have sanctioned for complicity in the Uyghur genocide that's going on. The government's got to get tougher even still. And can I just say, the problem right now is that in the integrated review that my right honourable friend quite rightly referred to, we refer to Russia as a threat, but China as a systematic challenge. Just given that the head of MI6 said that the biggest single priority for MI6 was adapting to the world affected by China, doesn't she think, like I do, that it is time to change our position and call China the threat that it really is to us.
Well, my right honourable friend speaks a great deal of sense on this issue, and I think he's just highlighted and spoken very, very clearly about, as we've seen in this House alone, the direct threats when it comes to undermining our democracy. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, I mean, if I may, I'm very conscious that a number of our parliamentarians have been sanctioned by the Chinese government as well for speaking out. Quite rightly so. We live in a free country and an open democracy, and we are privileged to do so, for speaking out very clearly and rightly so against abusive actions of the particular government at hand. So it is right that we constantly review all our threats from adversaries. They manifest themselves in different ways, and I can give him my complete assurance that I will be working with my colleagues across government to make sure that that absolutely happens.
Beauregard.
Mr. Speaker, through you, may I please thank members from all across this House for the kind messages I've received over the past few days. I welcome the Home Secretary's statement and the work of the security services in protecting Parliament. Will the measures she has announced help MPs to get extra support when making the required checks about the true source of any donations? She will know the security services told me their alert was based on specific intelligence of illegal funding, which did not relate to the donations that paid for my office staff. Those ceased in 2020. So is she able to tell the House what steps she is taking to ascertain where the tainted money ended up?
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, well, first of all, if I may say so, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will continue to work with the intelligence and security services and cooperate with them at the highest level with regards to the alert that has been published, and also the areas, if I may say so, that he himself has referred to. It is a fact, Mr. Speaker, that across this House we will absolutely come together to do everything possible in terms of protecting the integrity of our democracy and all honourable members from such malign interference and threats. And of course I look forward to working with you, Mr. Speaker, to close down some of these permissive loopholes that have clearly been exposed in the way in which have been so public in the last few days.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great pleasure to hear my right honourable friend's statement today. The work that she has done in defending this country from foreign interference and indeed in protecting British nationals who have been under threat of Chinese state propaganda and influence has been impressive, from her work on the Foreign Affairs Committee to her work in the Department and protecting British nationals overseas. May I ask, on the basis, building on the questions that my right honourable friend for Chingford and Wood Green quite rightly asked, what are we going to be doing more to make sure that this dirty money doesn't come into our community? The work that she did on the committee, she will remember, raised the idea in 2019 of a Foreign Agents Registration Act, which would have exposed to criminal prosecution those who put money into our system to undermine our democracy.
Well, my honourable friend absolutely knows my own views in terms of the whole area of foreign agent registration. And the need to, this isn't shining a spotlight anymore, this is putting the full beam of transparency around the dirty money that comes into our country. And it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, if I may just have your indulgence for a second, I mean, for those of us that spend time reading banking reports and financial reports as well, it has been self-evident in terms of being able to follow the money that has had the most corrosive influence in some of our institutions. So I've referenced, Mr. Speaker, already new legislation that will come forward. This is absolutely an area that we are keen to pursue, working with our colleagues across government, and that is something that my department will lead on.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I completely agree with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford. I think we have to have our eyes wide open about possible infiltration of the British politics from Iranians, from Russians and from China. And I think that the government should indeed be sanctioning Chen Jianguo, Zhu Hailun, Zhu Changqi, Huo Linjun, and for that matter, Carrie Lam, who have been undermining human rights both in Hong Kong and in China. But my biggest anxiety is, we've been saying now for quite a long time, ever since she was on the Foreign Affairs Committee with us and we produced the Moscow's Gold Report, that we needed to make sure that it was illegal to act as a foreign agent in this country. And the Intelligence and Security Committee report says quite clearly in paragraph 111, this still isn't the case. Now, I know she's been consulting on it. Can I just tell her, get a blasted move on?
Home Secretary.
No, the right honourable gentleman makes his point very, very powerfully. No question about that. And he knows effectively the work that I am trying to push forward on this, but also the need to bring forward the legislation. We've had the consultation. We have to consult clearly. And as I have said already, Mr. Speaker, we are going to be bringing forward the legislation. We need the parliamentary time to do this. We've got a busy timetable, and we are absolutely working. No, Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely working to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I declare an interest as someone who has been banned, not bunged, by the Chinese government? And, Mr. Speaker, you very boldly and rightly banned the Chinese ambassador coming from the Palace of Westminster when 7 parliamentarians and our families were sanctioned by China. Does the Home Secretary agree that it will be right that anybody determined to be an agent of influence or people close to them have no place coming to this place, sharing the resources, having access to ministers, parliamentarians and intelligence or any other government department? And will she also make sure that there is a proper audit of the activities of the United Front Work Department and the harassment and intimidation they bring to members of the Chinese diaspora around the country as well?
Well, my right honourable friend has just really articulated very clearly the extent to which we've been experiencing across the board here, but obviously for the diaspora community as well, intimidation and harassment. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, having brought forward the scheme to secure British nationals overseas, I heard the most harrowing tales, the most appalling cases and abuses of people from the BNO community that were just subject to all sorts of dreadful, dreadful things. So he is right, and I do just want to give assurance on a number of fronts, actually. First of all, if I may, not just in relation to Parliament and this House, but across government and government departments as well. There are audits taking place. Let me just make this very, very clear around individuals that could have or may have had access to government departments over a period of time, but also in terms of meetings that may have taken place, and not just with ministers, but actually with officials as well. These alerts going forward, Mr. Speaker, will also be shared with officials, not just in Whitehall, but across the country, local government, because we do know that the footprint goes much wider than just at the heart of government.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Home Secretary for her statement. It's truly sickening that anyone would attempt to infiltrate our Parliament, circumventing the security of this place and even that of Prime Ministers. I am also deeply concerned that following a massive spike over the last 2 years in racist attacks levelled at East and South East Asians during the pandemic, that we may see this serious incident cause the rest of an entire community and ethnicity to become targets for abuse yet again. What will her department do to ensure that that does not happen?
Well, can I just thank the Honourable Lady? She's made a very, very important and powerful point. She really has. And of course, racism and racist abuse across any community is absolutely abhorrent, and we have to work to stamp that out and stop that. And she's right to highlight that throughout the coronavirus pandemic, it's a tragedy. It is absolutely awful to know, and it is a fact, that the Southeast Asian community has been particularly vilified and subject to racist abuse. It is right that we, not just as a government, but also the Home Office, working with our community partners as well, do absolutely everything possible, and working with the police to make sure that any racist incidents are absolutely dealt with in the right and proper way, but also that we give the right kind of protective measures, awareness and support to members of that community.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The granting of a parliamentary pass is a real privilege. And I think that all of us should take responsibility to help the House authorities and the security service when we are actually looking at people in our own offices, because we have the right to nominate people. I think we bear responsibility for checking out these individuals as well. And may I suggest, from my previous experience in the military, that one way of doing that is to make each and every one of us sit down with anyone that wants a pass who is coming into our office and jointly go through a detailed form with very detailed questions and jointly sign at the end of it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, if I may, Mr. Speaker, I come back to the comments that I made earlier on about vetting and the support, of course, that is currently in place and where we can work together to absolutely close down any issues of concern. And, Mr. Speaker, I think for the assurance of not just all members of the House, but actually to the British public, who will no doubt be watching this debate and discussion today, wondering how on earth can any malign influence get into the heart of our democracy, we will continue to work collectively to make sure that we put all the protective measures in place.
Van Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary in a statement said it's been a fact this kind of activity has become more apparent. But the United Front Works Organisation has been in existence since 1949. It is a £3 billion a year budget. It's over many years used useful fools to propagandise its arguments. But could I ask the Secretary of State, particularly in terms of universities, because there is evidence, certainly Australia and other countries who have taken tough action, that the Confucius institutions are backed by money from the United Front. Isn't it about time we actually close them down? And is she content that the Department of Education is responsible for monitoring this?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman, makes a number of points. And first of all, in relation to the prevalence of the activity we are seeing, and yes, there is more activity for a number of reasons. Technology changes, these threats evolve, they develop and evolve with time, and as tradecraft also adapts and evolves too. Which brings me on to his second point, which is actually about our academia and our institutions. And it is an ongoing discussion. I've been in many committees, in fact ISC as well, where this has come up, and across government. He has asked whether the Department of Education are doing enough. We are working with them, we have been working with them for a great deal of time, and in particular, if I may, with reference to the legislation that we want to bring forward. Number one, we are learning from other countries. Australia, I had a bilateral just last week. This is part of Five Eyes work as well. There's a lot of work that is taking place to look at the institutional impacts of state activity, hostile state activity, alongside issues such as foreign agent registration. We want to get this right through future legislation. That's what we're working through.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, this is a really important issue and one which has lessons for all of us as parliamentarians and for all political parties as well. And it does seem to me that the crucial thing, as the Home Secretary has highlighted, is the whole business of foreign donations and cash being used for inducements, which is the main reason why, for the 10 years that I have chaired the All-Party Parliamentary China Group, all our sponsors have been British organisations. Does the Home Secretary agree with me that, firstly, we do need to get a grip of the whole issue of foreign donations from wherever they come from, because third-party countries can be used as well? Secondly, that the Standards Committee of this House needs to look more closely at whether any particular individual parliamentarian needs to be investigated. And thirdly, does she agree with me that while, of course, we have to rise to the systematic challenge that the integrated review raises of China, we do not wish to avoid any engagement with a nation which is a fellow permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and with whom we have much important business to deal with?
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend makes a number of points. And first of all, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the House and standards and transparency, there are measures in place already, as we well know. And as I've already said, Mr. Speaker, there'll be greater work taking place. And obviously, we will support all aspects of Parliament to ensure that anything where more work can be undertaken on transparency, absolutely, that will take place. The Honourable Gentleman also references effectively China and China's role in the world, multilateral institutions, organisations, when it comes to actually our own values versus the type of values that the Chinese government are proposing around the world. I think it's fair to say there are many difficult issues with regards to China This House recognises them. I recognise that as Home Secretary. The entire government recognises that. I've already alluded to issues such as human rights abuses, whether it's for the Uyghurs or even people, BNOs, who I have assiduously helped and set up a bespoke scheme to ensure that they are safe despite the measures that are being put in place by the Chinese government. We, Mr. Speaker, as a government will always stand for what is right in the world. That also means international law, rules-based system, and also calling out those that absolutely behave in an appalling and inappropriate way on some of the issues that I've touched on.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I remind the House that I serve as co-chair of the APPGs on the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, and I'm a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which is chaired by the Right Honourable gentleman from Woodford and Chingford and Woodford Green. Can I say to the Home Secretary, I've heard what she said in relation to the implementation of the Intelligence and Security Committee's Russia report, and I hope now that there will be a bit more urgency in the implementation of the recommendations of that, not least because we anticipate before too long the issue of their China report. But can I say to her also that if this is to be done effectively and that this House and indeed this Parliament can then present a united front to the outside world, she should really be working now with all parties across this House in order to build the consensus necessary to implement these recommendations.
Well, no, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his comments and his points, and absolutely we will always, on issues such as national security, intelligence cooperation, he himself is privy to much of that work as well and will understand the approach that we do take. When it comes to legislation, obviously this is under development. There's a whole raft. There are just so many aspects where we know we need to legislate. I've touched on criminal thresholds that need to be looked at, but also the changing nature of the threats, schemes that we are looking at that are already run in other countries, jurisdictions overseas, and how we can apply them to our own jurisdictions. That does take time to work through them. But of course, let me just give the House, Mr. Speaker, every assurance that we will work in a collaborative way on these measures.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, I wrote a paper on how to bring in a foreign lobbying law into the UK. The Security Minister has a copy of that. With great respect to the Home Secretary, I think these scandals are just going to carry on as they have been doing ever since I got here, until we update our espionage laws, until we update our domestic lobbying laws, and until we bring in a foreign lobbying law. The Australians and the Americans, examples of which I looked at in the paper, they have robust laws that cover banking, that cover finance, that cover law, that cover politics, that cover information. We need these laws, otherwise these scandals will just keep on coming, as sure as eggs is eggs. Thank you.
Mark is absolutely right, but he has also just touched on the wide-ranging nature of threats. And of course that covers, as I've touched on, Mr. Speaker, institutions, finance, all aspects of direct harm to individuals. There's a great deal of work taking place, as he will know, on the economic front, on the financial front as well. And I know he and the Security Minister discuss much of this too. Let me just give him the assurance that through the work that we are undertaking, and he's very welcome to come and have further meetings with us on this, he will see the way in which we are pulling these strands together, but importantly also learning from some of those other countries that he's referred to in his own previous report as well, where we are looking to create similar types of schemes, but obviously within our legal framework and within the lawful way in which we can actually implement them.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chinese state holds a 33% stake in Hinkley Point, a 10% stake in Heathrow Airport, a 9% stake in Thames Water, and moreover, a number of the UK's top universities have ties with Chinese and military-linked research centres. For more than 18 months now, the Labour front bench has been calling on the government to undertake a comprehensive audit of every aspect of the UK-China relationship so that our businesses, universities and public figures are aware of the risks and the threats to our national security. Will she now agree to get this audit underway as a matter of the utmost urgency?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question and actually the context of his question as well. He has just highlighted the extent to which China has been investing in the United Kingdom across our utilities, across various aspects of business, our institutions, academia, as we touched on earlier on as well. which is why, of course, you have the National Security and Investment Act, which is a response to many of the things that have taken place, predating many of us in office and some aspects of this government as well. We constantly have to not just keep a watching eye, but review and look at the investments that are coming into the United Kingdom. And that work is taking place across the whole of government.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for her statement. The word covert has been used quite a bit, but the Chinese Communist Party are acting in plain sight. They are threatening the House, they are threatening MPs, then they sanction MPs who expose what they are up to. And my question to my right honourable friend is, where is the organising force of this government? And I respectfully say to the Speaker the same, where is the organising force for this House in defending our democracy and also ensuring that we aren't complicit in genocide? Can I ask my right honourable friend what support is being provided to parliamentarians who have been sanctioned, to those individuals who gave evidence to my select committee, especially the World Uyghur Congress, who feel threatened in this country? Why aren't we blacklisting firms selling our data to the Chinese Communist Party, selling us products made by Uyghur slave labour? And finally, can I ask my right honourable friend to do everything that she can to get those individuals sanctioned for running those prison camps in Xinjiang, in particular Quenchango?
Well, I thank my honourable friend not just for her question, but for her commitment and the work that she's been leading on as well. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank all parliamentarians that have been so vocal on many of the abuses that have been well rehearsed and debated in this House. I think she's made a number of points, a number of questions, and first of all, in terms of the support for parliamentarians who've been sanctioned, which is a really important point. Of course, that is where the House needs to unite, and through the parliamentary authorities and, of course, us as well, we are coming together to ensure that measures are put in place. But she's highlighted a number of areas. She's asked, actually, where is the might in government? And when it comes to defending democracy, of course, she will know this because she would have had the discussions with my colleagues at the Cabinet Office as well, who lead on this, and other departments absolutely work aligned in an aligned way with them on the specific details. There is a great deal of work that is taking place which covers all aspects of threats, and I've touched on institutions, education, business, National Security Investment Act, but also space such as cyber, for example, and direct threats to individuals too. She's asked, and in fact she's not the only member to touch on sanctions of key individuals. I have heard the calls from all members on this particular issue, and I'll be raising it with my counterparts, clearly in the Foreign Office.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our relationship with China has rightly evolved from the golden decade heralded by the previous Conservative Chancellor, George Osborne. Today, members across the House have raised issues on political interference, on university research, technology transfer, the diaspora presence here, human rights, investment in this country. And the Secretary of State seems to imply that the work on the National Security and Investment Bill will address all these issues. It will not. So will the Secretary of State commit to the audit of UK-China relations that Labour has been calling for?
Well, I think, first of all, Mr. Speaker, if I may, there is a whole raft of work that is taking place, not just within on China, but also in relation to the integrated review. And I'm sure she's seen that. There'll be new legislation that is coming forward, and there is a great deal of work that's taking place. Much of it is unspoken, that takes place, obviously, with our security and intelligence agencies that influence the work of government as well, and government departments and the agencies within government on China. It is right that we do everything, absolutely everything. New threats evolve, technology advances, tradecraft advances as well, which is why we put the very significant investment and resource, not just into law enforcement, but our intelligence agencies who inform government departments and ministers in terms of the approaches that we should be using.
Alicia Katz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The actions of the Chinese government towards members of this House, and apparently now within this House, are unforgivable. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how within the counter-hostile state bill we could put in place a protection not only for members of Parliament but all British nationals when hostile Interpol red notices are placed upon them? And does she agree with me that every member of this House should be taking it upon themselves to make sure we do not act as helpful idiots for our enemies?
Well, my friend has, I think, summed it up really quite well. Of course, she will very happy to meet with her in relation to the legislation that is under development. There is a very, very poignant note here, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we've touched on defending democracy, exposure to Parliament by those that seek to do us harm, but actually it goes much wider than that, as I've already alluded to. It does go to different institutions, it goes to officials, it goes to civil servants, it goes across the board, and everyone should be very, very well attuned to the type of engagements that they are having from individuals and what their motivations are.
Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying that we all have to do everything we can to prevent foreign influence buying their way into our democracy. But there is an opportunity to deal with an aspect of that today, which is the shell companies that can be used to hide the sources of money that is being used for that purpose. Can you say why it is the government aren't supporting that move today?
So there is, Mr. Speaker, work that's underway, and in fact the Security Minister is also working with his Treasury colleagues and counterparts on looking at that whole area, and there has been a lot of work that's taking place on that. We're very happy to write to him directly to give him an update on that.
Teresa Villiers.
Will the government outline the action it's going to take to work with UK business and universities to ensure that they're more resilient and more effective at protecting their data, their research and their intellectual property from theft and interference by foreign governments?
Home Secretary.
This work is already underway, so let me just give the Right Honourable Lady that reassurance. Much of this work is underway through the National Cyber Security Centre, who constantly not only put out alerts across the board, but actually have direct engagement with these institutions, and that work, of course, will continue to carry on.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the Home Secretary's answer to my honourable friend for Eltham, tonight this House will be debating the elections bill, and whilst it's important to make sure that we can close loopholes which allow foreign money to flood into our British democracy, it's also important to make sure that we don't create new loopholes. So can I draw the Home Secretary's attention to the changes which will allow millions more citizens overseas to donate to British politics? And can I ask her, in light of what she knows from the Russia report, which the Minister for the Elections Bill hasn't read, as she told us in committee, with her knowledge of that, can she say, does this elections bill make us more or less safe from foreign interference in British politics?
I think it's important to say through the elections bill actually covers a whole range of aspects of protecting democracy and also electoral reform. But I think it's really important right now to recognise the work that is taking place across the board with the Cabinet Office, and I know Cabinet Office ministers later on will be speaking much more about this.
Nikki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I first start by paying tribute to our outstanding security services who keep us safe day in, day out. Mr. Speaker, I have been astounded by some of the eye-watering sums that some individual parliamentarians have received from Christine Lee and organisations connected to her. Does my right honourable friend think that those individuals should be paying back those sums, and if not to the the people who've donated already, but perhaps to a charity connected to human rights in China?
Home Secretary
has raised some tantalising recommendations, I think it's fair to say, for consideration. I think it's important, first of all, Mr. Speaker, for anyone that obviously has been in contact with the individual or received anything from the individual, that they continue to cooperate with our intelligence and security services.
Dr. Matthew Uppert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Friday's announcement came as a surprise to many people, but not a shock to many of us in Hendon, because it was in fact my predecessor, Andrew Dismore, who established the British-Chinese project here in Parliament. And he subsequently not only went on very many trips to China, but also the Hendon Labour Party received over £6,500 in donations. When I was first elected, representatives, I can only presume, who were connected to this individual, came to me and I rejected their overtures. So can I agree with the Honourable Member for Aberfan and to say that we need an audit, not only of what's gone on in terms of our political system, but also in terms of our social and civic society?
If I may, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very, very important and valid point, and not only that, I think I'd like to speak to him as well about some of the points that he's made.
Catherine Fletcher.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. £500,000 quid's a lot of money. And if I'd have looked at that, I'd have probably had a bit of a deeper scratch and sniff at it. However, by accident or whatever, there are people seeking to undermine our democracy. So can my right honourable friend tell me if we're going to nick them, if we're going to lock them up, and if they're going to face criminal charges?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend robustly makes her point, and she would have heard from my statement earlier on about the issue with the CPS and the approaches that they take, but also criminal thresholds. There are ongoing investigations taking place right now that I cannot comment on. But, Mr. Speaker, a review of criminal thresholds will take place because we need to see action taken against individuals that undermine our democracy.
I'd also like to add, quite rightly, we will work very closely between the Home Secretary and the services and this House to ensure that members are kept safe, that we do put the right protection. And I will also stress from this chair, I think it is wrong. I think the time has come for China to lift the sanctions against members of this House and the other House. The sooner they do that, the more trust can be rebuilt. But while that exists, trust will always begin to fail. Right. We're now going to come to the next statement. Just before I call the Secretary of State, I would like to point out there was extensive media stories over the weekend about the future of the licence fee and the funding arrangements for the BBC. I also understand that the Secretary of State either lost a phone or tweeted about the subject, stating that the licence fee announcement will be the last. These are very, very important matters which affects all of our constituents, and it is right that this House has, and quite rightly, a very keen interest. Any substantial policy development should have been made to this House before being made through the media. I am glad that we're having a statement today, but it's not enough for this House to come second to the media, especially on subjects like this, which are of interest to all. When the House is sitting, important policy statements must be made here before they're made to the media, as required by the government's own ministerial code. In any event, I will always ensure that the House has the opportunity to scrutinise important policy announcements, and that the government may well find those opportunities are more frequent, more extensive, if announcements are made to the media first. And I would say I have the greatest respect for the Select Committee. I have a great respect also for the Secretary of State. But please, can we make sure in future it's done through here? And if, which I may believe, that if it was leaked and that you felt you had to respond, Secretary of State, please let us do the leak inquiry, because we've got a major colander right across government that I don't want to see again. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I personally, Mr. Speaker, give you my apologies. I actually refused every invitation for media, both yesterday and today. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement. Under Article 43 of the BBC's Royal Charter, I am required to determine a funding settlement for the level of the licence fee for a period of at least 5 years, from the 1st of April 2022. I am legally required to make my determination as far in advance of April as possible. I'd also like to highlight that this year the licence fee settlement has featured S4C prominently for the first time, in line with the recommendation from the independent review as S4C completed in 2018. The licence fee will be the sole source of public funding for S4C. Negotiations back in November 2020, they began back in November 2020, and both I and my predecessor have met with the BBC on several occasions during this period to discuss the settlement. As part of those negotiations, the Charter requires that I assess both the BBC's commercial income and activities and the level of funding required so that the BBC can effectively fulfil its mission and public purposes. In addition, this government has set out our own relevant factors to consider during the Charter Review in 2015-16. Evasion, commercial income, household growth and industry costs. Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister has said, the BBC is a great institution. It has a unique place in our current cultural heritage. And beyond our shores, the BBC broadcasts our values and identities all over the world, reaching hundreds of millions every day. Likewise, the Welsh broadcaster S4C plays a unique and critical role in promoting the Welsh language and in supporting our wider public service broadcasting landscape. However, Mr. Speaker, in reaching this settlement, I had to be realistic about the economic situation facing households up and down the country. The global cost of living is rising, and this government is committed to supporting families as much as possible during these difficult times. Given that climate, we had to think very carefully about imposing potential increase on the TV licence, particularly given that any increase would expose families to the potential threat of bailiffs knocking on their door or criminal prosecution. When it comes to monthly bills, this is one of the few direct levers that we have in our control as a government. And in the end, Mr. Speaker, we simply could not justify putting extra pressure on the wallets of hard-working households. Every organisation around the world is facing the challenge of inflation. I simply do not believe that those responsible for setting household bills should instinctively reach into the pockets of families across the country for just a little more every year to cover those costs. So today I am announcing that the licence fee will be frozen for the next 2 years, and that it will rise in line with inflation for the following 4 years. The BBC wanted the fee to rise to over £180 by the end of this settlement. Instead, it will remain fixed at £159 until April 2024. That's more money in the pockets of pensioners, in the pockets of families who are struggling to make ends meet. Mr. Speaker, we are supporting households at a time when they need that support the most. And this settlement sends an important message about keeping costs down while also giving the BBC what it needs to deliver on its remit. This approach to funding will be the same for the BBC and for S4C. However, I can also announce that S4C will receive an additional £7.5 million per annum in funding from 2022 to support the development of their digital offering. This is a 9% increase for S4C following 5 years of frozen funding. Mr. Speaker, we believe that this is a fair settlement for the BBC. It is a fair settlement for S4C, and most importantly, it's a fair settlement for licence fee payers across the United Kingdom. And let's not forget, the BBC will continue to receive billions in annual public funding, allowing it to deliver its mission and public purposes and to continue doing what it does best. And to support the BBC even further in what is a fast-changing broadcasting landscape, the government will more than double the borrowing limit of the BBC's commercial arm to £750 million. This will enable the BBC to access private finance as it pursues an ambitious commercial growth strategy, boosting investment in the creative economy across the UK. But as Tim Davies said in his first speech as Director General of the corporation, the BBC must be a simpler, leaner organisation that offers better value to licence fee payers, and we agree with this. Ultimately, the settlement strikes the right balance between protecting households and allowing broadcasters to deliver their vital public responsibilities, whilst also encouraging them to make further savings and efficiencies. Mr. Speaker, the licence fee settlement is only one step in our roadmap for reform of the BBC. In the last few months, I've made it clear that the BBC needs to address issues around impartiality and groupthink. Those problems were highlighted definitively by the recent Sirota review, and the BBC's own leadership rightly recognised those findings in full and committed to deliver all of the review's recommendations in its 10-point action plan on impartiality and editorial standards. And I have had constructive discussions with the BBC about these issues in recent months. But the BBC now needs to put those words into action. It needs to convince the British public that those changes are in fact being made and to provide regular and transparent accounts of its progress. We will shortly begin the mid-term review of the BBC's charter, which will consider the overall governance and regulation of the BBC, and a key part of that review will look at whether the BBC's action plan on impartiality has in fact materially contributed to improving the internal governance of the organisation. But it's also time to look further into the future. Mr. Speaker, as any serious commentator will tell you, the broadcasting landscape has changed beyond all recognition over the past decade. We're living in a world of streaming giants, of on-demand and on pay-per-view and smart TVs. Technology is changing everything. 97% of homes already have super-fast broadband. A family in Cumbria can stream 5 different movies in 5 different rooms in its house at any one time. And our gigabit rollout is transforming those networks even further. Over 65% of UK households now have access to the fastest connection on the planet. As the tech has changed, so have audience habits, particularly amongst younger viewers. So it's time to begin asking those really serious questions about the long-term funding model of the BBC and whether a mandatory licence fee with criminal penalties for individual households is still appropriate. As we have said before, we will therefore undertake a review of the overall licence fee model, and those discussions will begin shortly. Mr. Speaker, the BBC has been entertaining and informing us for 100 years, and I want it to continue to thrive and be a global beacon in the UK and in the decades to come. But this is 2022, not 1922. We need a BBC that is forward-looking and ready to meet the challenges of modern broadcasting. A BBC that can continue to engage the British public and that commands the support from across the breadth of the UK, not just the London bubble. A BBC that can thrive alongside Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of its other challenges which attract younger viewers. The licence fee settlement represents a significant step in that journey and in our wider reform of the BBC. I look forward to continuing working with the BBC and others across the industry over the coming years to secure the future of these vital British services. I commend this statement to the House.
I now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I completely agree with you that it's a disgrace that announcement of this importance was not first made to Parliament, and I look forward to the leak inquiry that you mentioned as well. May I take this opportunity to congratulate the Secretary of State for coming top of the teacher's pet list. She was the first Cabinet Minister to tweet support for the Prime Minister. She was the first to volunteer to do a broadcast round. And now she's been the first to throw up a distraction and in finding someone else to blame for the Prime Minister's disintegrating leadership. The BBC's reporting, of course. The licence fee deal must be fair to fee payers, whilst ensuring the BBC can do what it does best. There should be no blank cheques. However, the government claims this is all about the cost of living crisis. I mean, pull the other one. What is it about the £13.57p a month that marks it out for such immediate and special attention to address the cost of living over the £1,200 a year increase in energy and household bills, or the £3,000 a year taxes increases that her government has imposed? Is the licence fee really at the heart of the cost of living crisis? Or is this really about their long-standing vendetta against the BBC? Now it's part of Operation Red Meat to save the Prime Minister from becoming dead meat. Apparently, negotiations with the BBC hadn't even been finalised when the Culture Secretary gave the details to the Sunday newspaper on the very weekend the Prime Minister's position was most in peril. I leave it to you and others, Mr Speaker, to judge the timing of that. She has proven today the Conservatives may know the price of the licence fee, but not its value. The last time they targeted it, the over 75s paid the price. So what assessment has she made of the impact of this 2-year freeze on BBC output and commissioning and on the wider creative industries more broadly? Is she happy to become the Secretary of State for repeats? But this isn't enough. Oh, there's more coming, there's more coming. We've got lots of fun to be had with this, don't worry. But this isn't enough red meat for the Culture Secretary. She won't stop until her cultural vandalism has destroyed everything that's great about Britain. Vandalism is exactly what it is: to tweet on a Sunday with no notice, no discussion or thought, the end to the unique funding of the BBC altogether, without any clue as to what will replace it. So perhaps she will explain how the BBC will continue valued services that just wouldn't be commercially viable. First, how can it continue to support local journalism where so many have recently failed? In many areas, the BBC is the last local news desk standing. Second, how would a commercial-only BBC be able to play such a crucial role, as it has done, to levelling up and growing the creative industries across our regions and nations, from Cardiff to Salford and elsewhere? They're silent on that one. I support the increased funding for S4C, but they claim to support the union. So what assurance can she provide for the continuation of distinct broadcasting in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland when there's no licence fee? Third, would her cutback BBC be able to continue with the World Service and its global soft power, which her government's review only last year described as the most trusted broadcaster worldwide? Would it? Finally, what would happen to BBC Learning, Bite Size and children's educational programming, which frankly did a much better job than the government did of getting high-quality education into children's homes during lockdown when they couldn't even provide an iPad? The impartiality of the BBC is crucial to trust in it. By explicitly linking the charter renewal to the BBC's editorial...
Order. Quite rightly, I wanted to the Secretary of State in silence. I expect the same respect to be given to the Shadow Secretary of State. And those voices that I keep hearing, I know who's behind the mask, so let me reassure you that if you want to go out early, don't let me help you on your way. Lucy Powell.
I actually know that the honourable member is a big fan of mine, but he's just trying to hide it behind his mask secretly. The impartiality of the BBC is crucial to trust in it. By explicitly linking the charter renewal to the BBC's editorial decisions, the government sounds more like a tin pot dictatorship than a healthy democracy. The BBC creates great quality British-produced programming, from royal weddings to Strictly Come Dancing to Great British Drama and championing of new music. It's at the cutting edge of harnessing the digital age. Of course it needs to change with the times and review its output and reach, but it is a well-loved, trusted British treasure. It is the envy of the world. But the government is in trouble, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is casting around for people to blame, and the Culture Secretary has stepped up to provide some red meat. Well, it won't work. This is not how the future of our jewel in the crown and the cornerstone of our world-leading creative industries should be determined. She will have a fight on her hands if she wants to destroy it. Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think there are about 30 questions in that statement, so I'll try just to address the top points. So, first of all, Mr. Speaker, it is nobody's intention to destroy the BBC. In fact, I completely agree with the Honourable Lady, it is a beacon. But the BBC licence fee is not a small amount of money for families who are working hard across the UK, struggling to pay that bill or face bailiffs at their door or a court appearance in a magistrate's court. Who are we to say it is a small amount of money? That is a disgrace. It is a significant sum. It is also regressive. Whether you are getting by on a minimum wage or on a multi-million-pound presenter's salary, you fork out the same amount of money. That is not right. Only those who haven't faced hard choices on what they can or can't afford for their families on a weekly basis would claim that it was a small amount of money. And as a point of principle, we cannot add to that bill at a time when every family is facing pressure on their wallets. So would the Honourable Lady like to indicate from a sedentary position, does she support freezing the licence fee for 2 years and helping those hard-pressed families? Does she support it? Is that a no? She's shaking her head. So the Honourable Lady does not support freezing the licence fee to help those hard-pressed families who need every bit of help in the face of rising global energy costs and rising pressures on inflation. The Honourable Lady has declined to help those hard-working families. And, Mr. Speaker, what we are saying is that moving forward, we need to decide and discuss and debate. So bring it on, everybody in this House. Let's discuss what a BBC in 2027 will look like. It is not a policy. We're announcing a debate and a discussion. Let's all get involved positively.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottom.
Can I say to my right honourable friend that I'm not impressed by either the process or the proposal, and I don't think it necessarily leads to progress either. I'd be grateful to know whether there's an assessment of alternatives when they were put to Cabinet subcommittees, when the Cabinet considered this proposal, and why it is that this is the one thing where a government minister will claim that you can't have any kind of increase because of people being short of money. Other things that government run are linked to RPI or CPI. It seems to me that it would be better to have a discussion in this House as to whether we should have a moderated increase during the remaining years of this charter, and also that if she didn't say this is the last time there's going to be a charter with a subscription, could you please put the options in front of this House so that people like me who say if the choice is between the United States or the state, public broadcasting for the BBC and Channel 4 is better, in my view, than having everything go to some of the big media people around the world who won't maintain the kind of BBC which we've had for the last 100 years.
So, Mr. Speaker, the decision as to what the future funding model looks like is for discussion. It's not. It isn't even. Some of us may not even be here by the time 2028 arrives, but it is up for discussion, and that's what we need to decide moving forward. And I have the greatest respect for the Father of the House. He knows that. I've known him for 20 years. But I honestly cannot agree with the point that the BBC can just year after year after year continue to ask for more money from the British public. I just do not agree with that premise. I'm afraid that the BBC do not be under any illusion. They are going to continue to receive billions of pounds, even under this settlement, £23 billion over the course of this Charter to 2027 of public money. We cannot justify, in the face of rising inflationary pressures, increasing global energy prices, we cannot go to the British public and say, pay more, and if you don't, a bailiff will be on your door.
Spokesperson John Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, and thanks also to the Secretary of State for advance copy of the statement. Not that we needed an advance copy, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State shared her thoughts with Twitter. Plus ça change. Now, we all know the timing is to distract from the Prime Minister. The Secretary of State claims that this move will protect pensioners from court cases. This argument, of course, is disingenuous nonsense. It was this Conservative government which abolished the automatic free licence fees for the over 75s. If pensioners are struggling with the current BBC fee rate of 43 pence a day, imagine how they'll cope with the cost of a Netflix Sky subscription model. Everybody knows it, less programming at a greater cost. Now, the Secretary of State has spoken about exploring the options for the BBC, but in reality, I suspect her mind is well made up. She let this slip in the Select Committee when she said to me, and I quote, "How do I even know if the BBC is going to be going in 10 years' time?" Some custodian of public service broadcasting. The hostility towards the BBC and its future does not stem from a desire to protect pensioners, but rather from a visceral loathing of the Prime Minister's critics. Now, the Tory right hates the BBC almost as much as it hates Channel 4. That's why the Culture Secretary, a doting Prime Ministerial loyalist, is so determined to destroy both. She doesn't want to see Krishnan Gurumurthy, lead presenter of Channel 4 News, or Nick Robinson, a former chair of the Young Conservatives, no less, and now lead presenter on the Today programme, pin the Prime Minister or his slippery apologist down. Mr. Speaker, she knows, does she not, that the Tory right wants the broadcast media to be as sycophantic as most of the print press, offering fawning adulation to their leader. If the BBC is felled and Channel 4 privatised, free speech will be the victim, and we know, don't we, Mr. Speaker, that the result will be yet more obsequious, unquestioning news.
Mr. Speaker, I have no idea how anyone could make the leap from let's have a debate and a discussion in this House to how the future funding looks to privatisation. It's just, I have no further comment.
We now come to the Chair of the Select Committee, Julian Knight.
Mr. Speaker, speaking strictly personally, I welcome the freeze and the overt commitment to wean the BBC off the licence fee. As Lord Grey said on the Today programme this morning, nearly £160 is nothing to Gary Lineker, but it's a lot to our constituents. But I and the House would like more details, please, as to whether the licence fee will stop in 2028 or be phased out. The latter, in my view, gives the best chance of preserving the BBC's status in our national culture. And how is moving to alternative funding models going to work, given, first of all, the paucity of broadband coverage, old technology like Freeview being embedded in the system, and whether central government funding, which has been muted, could stand up legally and also measure the key issue of impartiality?
So, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his comments and his support on the freeze. I just have to take issue with the paucity of broadband, though. 97% of homes in the UK have superfast broadband, and that's in. And as I said, 97% of homes have superfast broadband, and we are rolling out gigabit. In fact, if you're in a house in Cumbria, you can download, as I said in my mistake, five videos, 5 movies in 5 different rooms in the house. So we don't have a paucity. And with regard to whether the licence fee will be phased out, what a future funding model will look like, those discussions, that analysis hasn't even begun. But everybody in the House is to be part of those discussions, should be part of those discussions, and will be. And I imagine that the DCMS Select Committee will be doing some very important work on this moving forward in terms of establishing a future funding model. And it is work that will continue in the future.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State say what impact assessment she's done that tells her about the impact that this change will have on households if the fees were increased, and also what the impact is going to be on services provided by the BBC as a consequence of these freezes in their income, on top of the 31% that they've had cut from income over the past 10 years, and how that will affect the services that are provided by the BBC, and how will they survive her plans for the BBC?
So, Mr. Speaker, we've been negotiating with the BBC over, both I and my predecessor, over a considerable period of time. The BBC will be meeting its mission and core purpose, and in terms of impact assessment, I think the most important impact assessment is that fewer families will end up in a magistrate's court.
Debbie Green.
Like many of the best things in this country, the BBC licence fee is something that may not work in theory, but works really well in practice, shown by very low levels of evasion. There are, of course, many alternative ways of funding it, but as the Select Committee that my right honourable friend referred to concluded last year, the government either needs to come out with a strong alternative to the licence fee that it can put to Parliament, or strongly support the current model for at least the next charter period, 2028 to 2038. Does she have that alternative on offer?
I thank my friend for his contribution, and we must. I'm afraid we differ in our opinion, and I think we have 5-6 years. That is plenty of time to decide what a future funding model would look like.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We abolished the radio licence fee in 1979 and moved to a TV licence fee. So I myself am not against moving towards an internet licence fee or something like this. But we need to know the details, the thresholds, the amount of money that will be raised from those things. Does the Secretary of State accept that her announcement that this would be the last licence fee, without going through the consultation first, was reckless?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, in 2027 or 28, when it starts, many of us may not even be here. We're talking 6 years away. I welcome my honourable friend's contribution. I look forward to him being part of the discussion and debate about what we do in the future.
Brian.
State will know that the Select Committee report that my honourable friend from Ashford just referred to acknowledges its very first recommendation that government will need to act to ensure public service broadcasting remains sustainable in today's global media marketplace. So in that sense, I'm really glad that we're having the debate, even if I am a little unclear as to where it came from this weekend. So could I ask my right honourable friend, given that report is also clear the government need to have this credible view on what an alternative to the licence fee might be, and indeed we say what their vision is for the future of public service broadcasting, could I just ask my right honourable friend, what are her instincts as she kicks off this welcome national debate?
So I thank my honourable friend for his contribution, and my instincts are let's start the discussion. Let's have a look at this is what I'm starting, Mr. Speaker. Unless, of course, members of the House would just like us decide and not have the debates and not have the discussion. But that's where we're going. We're going to start that discussion. We're going to start that. Well, the Honourable Lady is speaking from a sedentary position, Mr. Speaker, which maybe she'd like to say and confirm. Does she support the freeze to the licence fee? Does she support a yes or a no, a nod or a shake would be great? No? There you go. We have it there. No.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Despite the removal of the free licence fee for over 75s being a result of her own party's actions, the Secretary of State's tweet yesterday indicated that her attack on the BBC was due to the over 75s being threatened with prison sentences and bailiffs knocking on their doors. Yet, less than 2 weeks ago, she told this House that no enforcement action has been taken against anyone over 75 years of age. I know, Mr. Speaker, that the Secretary of State would not make such claims without the evidence, so can she please now share with the House what data she found to support yesterday's comments?
The Honourable Lady drew a direct link between two different parts of my tweet, and there is no direct link. It's just one of many reasons why I want to look at how we fund a great British institution moving forward in the future.
Freeze the licence fee. However, the conversation over the future of the licence fee is far from over. What steps will the Secretary of State take to protect the BBC's local services, the services that those who pay for it watch and enjoy, before the knives are sharpened within the BBC?
So the conversation hasn't actually started, and that's and my own friend makes local radio is a very important point. Someone made the point about local BBC news coverage. And I would just say many of those in our constituencies used to have lots of independent news coverage as well in the past, which is no longer there, which was, some may say, the dominance of the BBC locally helped to contribute to that. But we haven't, and I would urge my honourable friend, he has some very important points to make and experience in local radio. I would urge him to be part of the discussion and to help us frame what it would look like moving forward.
Speaker. Growing up, my cousins overseas always told me they listened to the BBC when they wanted to know the truth. And I now represent somewhere known as BBC Borough. There's that many ex-employees, including myself, around. So could you tell all of us, where exactly was this in the Conservative manifesto? Because already people are seeing it as just a distraction for Partygate. And also, as someone who I remember seeing, I have fond memories of her in my constituency on reality TV on Channel 4. Does her trashing public service broadcasting apply to them too? Because that's a great Thatcherite innovation.
Excellent question. I'm not going to conflate Channel 4 with the BBC. I'm here to talk about the settlement of the licence fee. But, the second part of the question got me, I can't remember the first part. But there was no, she made a really important point about the BBC World Service. And we have, the BBC has, will be able to, with the billions of pounds and the billions of funding, £23 billion it's receiving, still be able to meet its core mission and purposes.
Be right.
Speaker, my right honourable friend must be right that the BBC can't stand still while the rest of the world moves along. But would she accept that when we think about the future funding of the BBC, we have to consider both the content that is marketable and which is going to be commercially successful, and the content that is not, but which will act as the beacon she describes not just to this country, but to the rest of the world in quality broadcasting and news and current affairs content in particular. And isn't that kind of content likely to continue to need subsidy in any future funding model we design?
So thank you for that contribution. He's absolutely right. One of the things we don't want is for all of our TV, which is streamed into the UK, to come from overseas. The discussion and the debates that we have about the future funding formula are going to have to include how we both protect, preserve, create great British content. And that has to be part of the debate moving forward. How can I tell about elements? No, I can't, because we haven't even begun the discussions yet. What modelling is there? There are a number of ways that I've been told already that we could look at funding the BBC moving forward. Well, it's not for me to decide. So we have to. It's not for me to decide until I have all the information and all the evidence.
Amy Stone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I just say to the Secretary of State, I wish I had the level of broadband coverage that she talks about in my constituency.
You're not alone.
when I was a councillor, a member of the Highland Council, I had to be very careful of the BBC because their reporting of all I said and did was very thorough indeed. And that was good for local democracy. Can I also say to the benches opposite that the coverage of the Scottish Government has been very thorough, and in the time of the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, it was so thorough that it reduced the then First Minister to near apoplexy, members will recall. So, a slimmed-down BBC may not be able to deliver this sort of service that's good for local democracy and for Scottish democracy. Could I ask the Secretary of State how she intends to make sure that we do not lose out on that front?
Well, democracy, particularly local democracy, is at the heart of a lot of what the BBC does. And that's why it will be an important element of conversations that we have moving forward, and an important contribution. And as I've said a number of times, the discussions, the debates which we will have in this place, the evidence that we will take moving forward, it hasn't begun. We're 7 years away. That's the consultation that we will have here, the evidence that we will gather here, the debates and discussions that we will have. Those discussions will start shortly. We're talking about a new funding model which will start in 2028.
John Whittingdale.
My right honourable friend will be aware that last year the number of TV licences purchased fell by 700,000, and that more and more young people are now saying that they don't need to watch the BBC because of the enormous amount of choice through the streaming services. Does she agree that even despite that increase in content, we will still need public service broadcasting in the BBC, and therefore it is right to have a debate about the future funding model, not to undermine the BBC, but to ensure that it can survive going forward?
I thank my friend, and that was my response to my earlier question. How do we keep good content, great British content made in the UK? The BBC is a national institution. How do we maintain the BBC? The question is not, do we or don't we have a BBC? The question going forward is, how do we fund the BBC moving forward? I know my honourable friend has made some interventions of his own and ideas of his own. I look forward to him furthering those moving forward.
Can I just say, many of us will find it nauseating that Minister comes here to talk about hard-pressed families when she supported a £20 cut in universal credit. But it's interesting that the Minister wants to come to this, I'm sure, in terms of objectively the fullest information. So could we test how much she considered some of these factors, maybe in the style of the broadcast media? So could she tell us how much more money is generated per pound by the investment in the BBC? Is it £1, £2 or £3? She talks about the North. How much impact, economic impact, is actually beyond London of the BBC? Is it 10% or 20% or 50%? Maybe she could just demonstrate her knowledge, at least, of the impact of the BBC now.
So, Mr. Speaker, the specific figures across the UK I will write to my honourable friend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 11 years ago, the then Director General of the BBC said the corporation would have to do fewer things better. The current Director General has set the organisation the challenge of prioritising how it spends its money and maximising its commercial revenues. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that reform is necessary for the BBC to thrive in the digital age, both in terms of how it works and how it's funded?
Thank my honourable friend for his informed question. You know, we can't ignore the fact that our digital landscape is transforming rapidly and that we are advancing at a huge pace, and that has resulted in people changing the way they view their viewing habits, the way they view their content, and particularly the younger generation. That is why we would be dinosaurs if I stood here and said, I would be accused of being a dinosaur if I stood here and said, we just let it go on, we just let the BBC carry on as it is, and we just assume that into the future we will carry on with this licence fee model. And as my honourable friend has highlighted, 700,000 people, fewer, bought the licence fee. We have to do something now in order to sustain the BBC and to maintain the British beacon that we have in the BBC moving forward. We have to act now to ensure that the BBC remains the BBC and it's here for the future.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, can I welcome the fact that at long last we have a minister who is prepared to grasp this nettle and to tackle the BBC poll tax and also stop the enforcement of payments by people who are angered by the bias of the BBC, and also force that organisation to look at its own bloated expenditure, and especially given that broadcasting is now changing to allow people greater choice. I hope that despite the cries of outrage from the BBC bodies in this House shall not back down on these issues.
I thank my honourable friend for his support, and I think it's just worth making the point that the BBC will continue to receive billions of pounds of funding, of public support and funding between now and 2027.
Sir John Redwood.
Will she decriminalise the licence fee to take the pressure off magistrates' courts? Shouldn't this be a household bill like others?
So it's something that we are keeping under review, and I would say as part of the discussions moving forward, you know, a model for the BBC of a licence fee paid by individuals with the potential threat of bailiffs or criminal prosecution is just, in today's age, really, is that how we're going to continue moving forward? And it's an important question and one that will be part of the discussion.
Green.
The establishment of the BBC in Salford, neighbouring my constituency, has created many excellent jobs for my constituents and has been both an economic and a cultural driver of success in the North West. But that isn't what I wanted to ask the Secretary of State about. Can she say what guarantees she can give to the BBC's excellent, world-class, salaried orchestras, like the BBC Philharmonic, whose concerts I've had the great privilege to attend as their guest?
So, Mr. Speaker, the BBC, as I've said, will continue to receive billions of pounds worth of funding. It will continue to meet its mission and core purpose, but I can't dictate how the BBC spends its money or have any editorial control. It's up to the BBC how they decide that they spend their licence fee settlement.
Alan Cairns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement and to recognise the priority she has placed within it on Welsh language broadcasting and the importance that it has on the Welsh-speaking community in Wales. In supporting her statement and in helping the BBC achieve its objectives under the new settlement, will my right honourable friend call on the BBC to follow other public sector organisations, improve their transparency and to publish every invoice in excess of £500, just like every other organisation?
Well, S4C plays a vital role in supporting the Welsh economy, culture and society. This funding will support S4C in reaching more Welsh language speakers, including younger audiences. And I'm very sure that S4C has just heard what he said, and I will certainly take his points back.
Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about value for money. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that 43 pence a day is value for money for BBC iPlayer, BBC Sounds, BBC World Service?
It's billions of pounds. And I don't believe that if you asked any family who was receiving repeated letters or a bailiff knocking on the door or a request to appear at a magistrate's court would think that it was value for money because it's money they can't afford. The issues that working families and those who are hard-pressed in the situation that we have with rising inflationary pressures think it is difficult to pay £159 a year out of their income, which is why we're freezing that money for the next 2 years and not allowing it to rise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement because household bills are under pressure, and I think it is reasonable to freeze the fee for 2 years. In the whole of the conversation, Mr. Speaker, and outside of this place and in this debate, we talk about television. and we talk about the streaming services. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that when the conversation takes place, we will have to make sure that the very important radio programmes across the board of the BBC are protected and are still funded, and we can't just compare it to a Netflix Apple model, because radio is such a key part of the BBC's output?
It absolutely is, and I think it will be a key part of the discussion. And you know, you mentioned, I think it was Apple and Netflix, and it's not the BBC's role to compete in a competitive way with other providers, but radio is certainly a huge part of the BBC and will be a huge part of the discussion.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Over the generations, people all over the world, some in fear of their lives, have huddled around their radios, straining to hear the words, "This is London," because they trust BBC World Service News. Given that a subscription service will never work for airwave radio, what assurance can the Secretary of State give those listeners and the House that the BBC's service to the world, which is the BBC World Service, will be able to continue to do its job?
Well, my own friend has jumped the gun in mentioning the words subscription service. I haven't mentioned subscription service. I've said that we need to have a debate and a discussion about how the BBC is funded moving forward in the future. And I completely understand his point, but how the BBC spends its money that it receives via the Charter is the BBC to decide how it spends. We don't have any influence over that.
Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State is absolutely right that we should be debating and discussing the future of the BBC. She mentioned in her statement two of the important elements of the Charter: to entertain and inform. Of course, there is a third one as well, to educate. And that is the area of public service media that is most difficult to commercialise. Can she assure me that she will ensure that that element of the BBC is protected going forward?
Very good.
Well, I hear his point, and I think a lot of people agree with him, and people have talked about the bite-sized contribution that BBC made during the pandemic, which is absolutely vital to many families who were homeschooling children at home, and I will bear his comments in mind and take them back.
Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State agree with me that, having shown in the past week that the government has shown contempt for the British people, today's announcement on the BBC shows they treat the British institutions with contempt as well?
No.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Friday, I introduced my private member's bill to abolish the BBC was to be read a second time. Unfortunately, there was not enough parliamentary time to proceed. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I publish quite a lot of private members' bill, and sometimes I get some support and sometimes I get some opposition. Getting rid of the BBC licence fee, tens of thousands of people supported it, and very few were against it. So can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House today and make a statement? And if my bill is any use to her, I'd be very happy to change in committee any of the stuff I have there at the moment.
Thank you, and I look forward to that.
Kevin Jones.
The Secretary of State has come to the House today to basically say the freeze in the licence fee is to help hard-working, struggling families. Can I ask her, though, could she answer the question that was put to her by the Father of the House? When was this decided? Did it go through a Cabinet subcommittee? Did Cabinet sign this off? Or is it that just over the last weekend we thought we'd come up with something which would take the attention away from the Prime Minister?
Yeah, Cabinet has signed it off. These negotiations have been going on with my predecessor as well as myself. I legally had to make my statement in as much time as possible before April, which is why I'm making it today.
Hugh Merriman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I often find those who are best placed to give their view on whether we need the BBC or not are those that have lived, worked, travelled abroad and haven't had access to the BBC, and therefore I applaud the constituent that's written to me having done just that and said the BBC needs to be celebrated and maintained because he sees what a future looks like in this country without the BBC. Can I ask the Secretary of State, given that inflation is expected to rise to 6% in the early parts of this year, what elements of conversation she's had about which content will be reduced as a result of this decision that she's making today?
So I thank my old friend for his contribution. Can I just say that I ran a school in Africa for a year, And I understand the value of the BBC World Service because I was a listener of the BBC World Service for a whole 12 months. And therefore, I, having lived in Africa and run a school in Africa for a year, also know the importance of the BBC. And it's why I've said all along, this discussion is not about do we have a BBC or don't we? It's about how do we maintain a BBC moving forward in a rapidly changing, modernising landscape. How do we fund the BBC in that event? So that is what the discussion is about moving forward, not whether or not there is a BBC.
Kirsty Blackman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm no fan of the regressive licence fee, but the Secretary of State saying on Twitter that this will be the last licence fee announcement is discourteous to this House, it's discourteous to all of the many people that watch and listen to BBC, and it's discourteous to all of those who are employed by the BBC. How does she believe that the 50 BBC employees based in my constituency are currently feeling because of the announcement she made on Twitter over the course of the weekend?
Mr. Smith, I think on Instagram, it's likely to be, because I cannot see a world, and I don't think many people can, see a world in 2028 where individual households are paying an outdated funding fee that was established in 1922 to fund an organisation that I don't think anybody could ever have seen what the digital landscape would be like today, or the viewing habits of young people today, or indeed what the opportunities will be in 2028.
Matt Morman.
Speaker. In some ways, the BBC is the best of global Britain, but in a globalised media landscape, we know that there are people prepared to pay for Netflix, for all those subscription services, and for web services, and for all the multitude of things the BBC offers. Isn't it daft that someone would suggest that she should stand up today and say, even from 2028 to 2038, you have to pay for the whole lot, whatever you want?
Yes.
So, and it's to my, and I thank my friend for his contribution and for his contribution to the department for the time that he was there, and he's absolutely right. It's to the point that it's not about do we have our great British institution of the BBC, which is globally recognised. That's not the question. The question is we live in a different world. People have different and changing viewing habits. And that, by the time we reach 2027, is going to be even, we can't even, I know when I started some of the negotiations, when my predecessor started some of the negotiations on this, TikTok didn't even exist. You know, we're moving rapidly to a different place, and that's why we have to have the debate.
Tulip Sadiq.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many of my constituents have written to me in praise of the recent BBC investigative documentary about the cladding scandal. One of my constituents, who lives herself in a dangerously clad house, talked about how much she appreciated the fact that there was an independent state broadcaster that challenged unethical companies. It was the BBC, may I remind the House, that revealed that warnings about cladding quality issues had been ignored for years. So could I ask the Secretary of State, does she recognise how crucial the investigative role of the BBC is? And in this discussion that she keeps talking about, can she assure the House that her proposals will not cut the budget for the investigative programmes of the BBC?
I don't set the budgets for the investigative programmes on the BBC. The BBC does that.
We know. Sir Edward Lee.
Clearly reform is needed. It's absurd in the modern world that people can be criminalised for not paying for a licence fee just for an entertainment show. But the devil is in the detail. I represent a very rural constituency where many smaller villages and hamlets can't get super-fast broadband. So before any final decisions are made or this reform is implemented, can we ensure that if we base public policy on the basis that everybody can stream programmes, they can actually stream programmes?
Good point.
I thank my friend on the policy. There is no policy. We're just starting a discussion and debate, but it isn't based on whether people can achieve streaming or not. But 100% of households achieving superfast broadband or gigabit broadband actually is the objective.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I heard what the Secretary of State said about S4C, but my constituency, Cardiff South and Penarth, would simply not recognise what she says about the BBC, the rest of the BBC being some sort of London bubble. We've seen a 54% increase in our creative economy locally, thousands of people employed. BBC at the heart of that, Doctor Who, Casualty, programmes like Shreds, the BBC National Orchestra of Wales. It's absolutely crucial. Every pound invested in our local economy by the BBC generates almost double that in return. Does she not accept that what she's suggesting today puts that at risk and puts many of those jobs and opportunities that we've seen in Cardiff, including in deprived communities, at risk?
Madam Deputy Speaker, S4C are going to receive a further £7.5 million per annum from the licence fee to support its digital investment. In total, this will provide S4C with approximately £88 million in licence fee funding per annum. And it's S4C we are committed to S4C, and we are providing additional funding to S4C.
Mr McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a former BBC and ITV journalist, I look forward to taking part in discussions about the future of the BBC. I'm a big admirer of local and regional BBC journalism, the local democracy reporter scheme, for example, the coverage of rugby league and local football, which wouldn't maybe happen on any other platform. But just in terms of Yorkshire and the location of the new headquarters of Channel 4, how does today's announcement impact on the timescale for the future announcements about the future of Channel 4, please?
I've made no announcements other than we're starting a discussion about the future funding of the BBC, and I'm here to make the statement on the settlement of the licence fee. I'm not conflating Channel 4 with this.
Catherine McKinnell.
Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State for Culture does not appear to be being straight with the House, because her tweet at the weekend said very clearly, this licence fee announcement will be the last. I'm reading it from Twitter. And that is why many of my constituents are concerned that the BBC's unique range of programming that brings together nations, regions and diverse communities in the UK are not safe in this government's hands. And the BBC's mission to inform, educate and entertain has worked for almost a century. So will the Secretary of State rule out today that she is not seeking to undermine and sacrifice this great national institution in order to save the Prime Minister's political skin?
I'm not, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Scott Benton.
Oh, yes, you are. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At a time when household budgets are under unprecedented pressure, the decision to freeze the licence fee will be universally welcomed in Blackpool. My constituents will also welcome the Secretary of State's comments that it is high time that we had a discussion about the very existence of the licence fee itself. But in the meantime, what discussions is the Secretary of State having with the BBC to ensure that it can achieve value for money in terms of a licence fee?
I have regular meetings with both the Director General and the Chair of the BBC and other members of this BBC to discuss those very issues.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. She says she can't tell the BBC what to do, but she also says she wants the BBC to play God Save the Queen more often. So I wonder whether she thinks today's announcement makes that more or less likely. And the BBC has also been described as the glue that holds the union together. So does slashing the BBC's funding the way she wants to going to make that glue stronger or weaker?
So I didn't hear the second part of the question, but what I would say is that what's wrong with playing God Save the Queen? What's wrong with it? The honourable gentleman asked the question as though that was a dirty word or something that she said. What is wrong with playing God Save the Queen?
David Simmons.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many of my constituents are also parents of young children, I have a daily battle to guide them away from some of the content on some channels towards the relative nourishment they'll find on the BBC. So I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, as we look to the future of the BBC, in addition to the scrutiny that is rightly placed upon the financing model, what objectives she might have in mind, or what process she might have in mind to ensure that the quality of the output, where the BBC is world leading in so many areas, is maintained for the long term and for the future.
Well, that's the point of discussion, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's why, and I've said again and again, It's about how do we protect the BBC? How do we ensure that, and under the agreement at the moment, and the settlement at the moment, it can continue to meet its mission and its purpose. But how do we protect the BBC going forward? How do we ensure that we have good quality content made in the UK and stays in the UK, and we can sell from the UK? And how do we, in this changing, shifting, rapidly moving landscape, how do we have a BBC that is funded for the future in order to protect it?
Chiomora.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that the Secretary of State for Digital has noticed that business models for content creation have changed in the last 100 years, but the need for a unifying shared expression of British culture, identity and creativity has not. So is not the real reason for this attack on the BBC that it is a successful British public sector institution and she just can't stand that?
No.
Rob Butler. Sorry.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was very proud to spend the first 7 years of my career at the BBC, but it's worth remembering that even then, in the 90s, there were only 4 main terrestrial TV channels. The Secretary of State is absolutely right that the whole landscape has changed fundamentally since then, and I tend to agree with her that the licence fee must therefore be on borrowed time. But does she agree with me that any new model of funding for the long term of the BBC will also need to take into account the possible implications and repercussions on the commercial public service broadcasters that currently rely on advertising?
That's a very important point, and everything needs to be considered. All elements of all the BBC's reach, everything that it does, everything that it achieves, everything needs to be considered in the round. That is why we have to start the debate now. Even though the future funding model wouldn't come in until 2028, that's why we have to start now. We need that time to prepare now to ensure that very point that all elements which are beneficial to the UK, which are beneficial to the BBC and to producing that great British content remain.
Ben Lake.
It was pleasing to hear the Secretary of State claim that she recognises the importance of Welsh language broadcasting, but she then proceeded to announce a real terms cut to the BBC settlement, a settlement, of course, that provides around £20 million of S4C programming annually, in addition to Welsh language services on Radio Cymru, Radio Cymru 2 and Cymru Fyw. So could the Secretary of State therefore explain how a real terms cut to the BBC settlement will not see a reduction in its important contribution to Welsh language services?
So, Amanda, as the S4C settlement will consolidate S4C's current £74.5 million licence funding with its current 6.8 annual DCMS grant income. The real terms cut that he has talked about to the overall BBC, that is a fact because we have frozen the licence fee for 2 years. But S4C's funding, which has not increased for 5 years, will now increase. The BBC's funding has always, every year, increased. It will now freeze for the next 2 years, but S4C's has always been frozen for the past 5 years. It will now increase.
Jerome Mayhew.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've got to accept that the media landscape, and importantly its use, has changed beyond recognition over the last few years. So I agree with Lord Grade, the former chair of the BBC, that a universal regressive tax to pay for a BBC that is no longer itself universally used is no longer defensible. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that the BBC, both now and in the future, will have a vital role to play in creating a version of our common truth, both at home and abroad?
And protecting that vital role of the BBC moving forward is one of the issues that we have to make sure that we protect, along with, as I've said, the British content that we make. The fact that the BBC is a global beacon around the world, the fact that there are people in countries, as my friend opposite has mentioned, who depend on the BBC. Maintaining the BBC is something that we have to protect, but funding the BBC and how it's funded, that is what is up for question, and that is what the discussion's about moving forward.
Claire Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm British and proud of it, and I'm proud of the BBC. The BBC reaches 468 million people in 42 languages around the world every week, and it's the envy of the world. Cutting funding to the BBC and the World Service is already leaving the path clear for Russian and Chinese influence in those countries. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that only an unpatriotic party would cut the real terms funding of this national treasure?
Unpatriotic. I don't think it was this side of the House that was laughing about the prospect of the national anthem being played on television. I think it was that side of the House that was doing that. And no, I disagree. I am not unpatriotic. I am very patriotic.
Gallus.
Trent North, Kids Grove and Talk want to see the licence fee scrapped. And when I had 3,000 respondents to a survey, 96% of them agreed with that. They feel that the BBC has spoken down to them when they voted for Brexit. They feel that it's out of touch with the people and the values of Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kids Grove and Talk. And it's time that the BBC, like the Labour Party, get out of the metropolitan bubble, spend some time in Stoke-on-Trent and understand what people think. So does my right honourable agree that it's welcome that she's frozen the licence fee, it's welcome that she's opening this conversation, and it's time to scrap the licence fee altogether?
So we can all see how, once again, my honourable friend speaks up for his constituents in Stoke, and it's just, and I'm really interested in the survey, and I'd love to see some of the responses that we receive from that survey. And we are looking at how he spoke not about scrapping the BBC, but about scrapping the licence fee, because I'm sure his constituents, both those who do want to watch and enjoy the BBC, it's about how do we fund the BBC in a modern digital landscape and at a time when young people consume their television in different ways. How do we fund the BBC to protect it and maintain it moving forward, but in a different way?
Brian.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish the Secretary of State would stop with the crocodile tears about the cost of living crisis, because £159 is a lot of money, in particular to my constituents, but it happens to be exactly the same amount as, on average, my constituents will be paying extra in national insurance from April of this year. So if they really cared about the cost of living crisis, they could do something about that. But what my real fear is the Secretary of State simply doesn't understand how intrinsic to the nature of the BBC and its success around the world is the licence fee. It means there's something for everybody, for all of my constituents, including the poorest member of my constituency who wouldn't be able to afford Sky. She says the BBC gets lots of money. Sky gets 5 times as much money this year, and its revenues this year have increased by 18.9%. Yes, this is an unpatriotic move, dismantling one of the greatest British treasures.
Well, I don't think I could say, I mean, my own friend talked about the £159. It's actually £180 that the BBC wanted this to project to. And this is one of the levers that we have in government in order to help hard-working families against those increasing inflationary pressures. But my own friends talk about, we're not here. We're here to help the BBC and protect the BBC. And the only way we can do that, and as I've said, I would be, well, I'll ask my honourable friend again, does she support the freeze, the 2-year freeze, the licence fee to help hard-working families? No. Again, no plan. You know, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady dodged that question on media this morning, and she's dodging it here in the chamber today.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I praise the Secretary of State for helping to tackle the rising cost of living for many families at a difficult time. And does the Secretary of State agree with me that whilst they're having to tighten their belts, perhaps the BBC should do the same? Perhaps a good place to start would be with salaries, including one of their presenters who earns £1.36 million per year.
So businesses across the UK are having to tighten their belts. Households across the UK are facing inflationary pressures and having to tighten their belts. The 2-year freeze on the licence fee means the BBC will be doing themselves. I couldn't agree with him more.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions, the Prime Minister himself was challenged about the future of the licence fee, and he seemed to caution against it by referring to the BBC as a great national institution. And yet by the weekend, the Secretary of State was tweeting that this would be the last licence fee agreement. So perhaps the Secretary of State could explain to this House what on earth has been going on in Number 10 since Wednesday that has led to what appears to be a screeching U-turn.
As I've said on a number of occasions, we've been having these discussions for months. In fact, my predecessor had the discussions before me. Legally, I have to make an announcement as far in advance as April as possible, and that's why I'm here today.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for her announcement freezing the licence fee and launching an inquiry into its future? And will she confirm for me, firstly, there's a difference between impartiality and the licence fee. They're different issues. Secondly, that if Netflix can go from 1/20th the size of the BBC to 8 times the size of the BBC in just 20 years, there's plenty of scope for creative thinking. And thirdly, will she encourage the leadership of the BBC to respond positively and not with a defeatist and backward-looking attitude of the Labour Party?
I thank my honourable friend and my neighbour, my constituency neighbour, for his question. And impartiality and the licence fee are two completely, entirely separate things. The Sirota review made its recommendations. The leadership of the BBC has fully agreed with those recommendations and has agreed to implement them. What we now want to see is transparency, to see what difference those implementations make, but they are completely different from the settlement of the licence fee. Two entirely different issues.
Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very proud of the BBC. I think it's the best of British, and I think it's recognised and respected across the world. I also think it's the best of value. When you compare that its fee actually works out to be 2/3 the price of a pint of milk per day. Now, I happen to know what the price of a pint of milk is. Isn't there a simple truth here that actually the Prime Minister, unlike previous Prime Minister, unlike Margaret Thatcher and so many others, he's frightened of the BBC, he's frightened of being scrutinised. Margaret Thatcher actually phoned in to the Radio 4 Today programme. We have a Prime Minister who would prefer to hide in the fridge.
The Prime Minister is a huge fan of the BBC, and he's a huge fan of the BBC Today. And the discussions that we're having and beginning are there to help protect the BBC, because for anyone to sit here today and think that we could go to households in 2028 and expect individuals to pay for a licence fee with fear of prosecution if they don't, in order to watch the television that they have bought and put into their house, is frankly a dinosaur. We have a responsibility in this House to protect the BBC, and as part of that responsibility we have to look forward and think, how can we change the BBC? How can we fund the BBC in a changing digital landscape?
Greg Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the chamber, we have a proud history with S4C, S4C, and today is another important step forward. Can I thank the Secretary of State for both making it S4C at the core of her statement today, but also for the £7.5 million increase per annum. And could I draw it into a meeting with myself and like-minded colleagues about the Welsh language and the fact that core public service broadcasters have nurtured it and helped grow, such as S4C and BBC Radio Cymru?
I'd be happy to, and to thank him. It's 5 years that S4C has had no increase in its funding. It was high time it did, when the BBC has had year-on-year increases in its funding.
Chris Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The family she talks of in Cumbria was streaming 5 different movies in 5 different rooms, are probably paying a minimum of £43 per month for Netflix, Sky and broadband. Included in that is not the social value the BBC provides, from educating youngsters through CBeebies and CBBC, through the company it provides to those who are suffering from loneliness, and also the innovation of the BBC iPlayer and BBC Sounds. Will she give an assurance that this freeze will not diminish those vital services the BBC provide?
The licence fee settlement of the BBC ensures that the BBC can continue to meet its mission and its purposes, and it will continue to receive billions of pounds of funding, £23 billion over the licence fee settlement.
James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When the BBC came before the Public Accounts Committee, it was striking how unambitious its target was to grow commercial revenues, which represent just 6% of its current income. Will this welcome decision, including increasing the borrowing limit which the BBC asked for, come with a requirement for them to rapidly grow that income and reduce the burden on the licence tax?
I thank my honourable friend, and increasing the access to private equity was one of the first steps in doing that.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already seen the loss of
hundreds of BBC journalists' jobs involved in the much-valued regional news and current affairs programming, including the excellent Inside Out programme. Before making the decision to freeze the fee, what assessment did the Secretary of State make of the impact on local and regional news programming?
It's about increasing and reforming and increasing services across the BBC to continue into the future, to ensure that the BBC is there in the future, to service his constituents by adopting a funding model that means that the BBC will be sustainable and will be there for the long term.
Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Putting BBC documentary into YouTube is one of the ways you can get a world-class education, because you can just learn about loads of different things. But that sentence also suggests that the world's evolving. So whilst I'm a huge fan of the BBC, and I do welcome this licence fee review, and to ensure that that stuff is still there for people like me and future generations. Does she agree with me?
I agree, and she's actually really encapsulated what is the situation that we're facing at the moment. The fact that BBC documentaries are being put into YouTube and people are watching them on YouTube. In fact, young people, I'm amazed to learn, consume huge amounts of television via YouTube. This is why we have to review and start the discussions about what is the future of the BBC funding stream going to look like.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr. Speaker. There will be considerable concern in Wales about the post-2020 situation, because the implied subscription type model will never work for S4C or Radio Cymru or the wider BBC in Wales. Will she pledge to ensure full consultation with Welsh stakeholders to ensure that the Welsh language isn't collateral damage in the British government's culture war against the BBC?
So, I thought he was going to thank me for the additional money that S4C, the £7.5 million that we're giving to S4C. I thought he was going to thank us for the fact that S4C has had its funding frozen for the past 5 years, but now it's increasing and we're freezing the BBC. However, I have never mentioned the word subscription. And as I've said time and time again, we need to start a dialogue about how do we fund the BBC in the future.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the freeze to the licence fee and the debate that is to come? Given the millions across the United Kingdom and abroad who do love the BBC, there must be countless options for future funding models for that content which can be commercialised. But will my right honourable friend agree with me that the most important strand of any reform is to de-link the requirement in order to watch other content to pay for the BBC?
An interesting concept, and it will be part of the discussion moving forward, I'm sure.
Margaret Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is one option the Secretary of State considering to increase funding allowing the BBC to carry advertisements? And if so, has she considered the risk of that, removing the balanced fact-based basis of BBC news reporting?
So, Mr. Speaker, as I said when I arrived at the dispatch box, that we are beginning the discussions about how a future funding model for the BBC will look. We've not gone into that level of discussion yet.
We now come to the next statement, which is from the Secretary of State for Defence. In calling Ben Wallace, I will not be running this long because of the nature of what's coming afterwards, but it's important for this to be taken. Ben Wallace, Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I wanted to update the House on the situation in Ukraine. As of today, tens of thousands of Russian troops are positioned close to the Ukrainian border. Their deployment is not routine, and they are equipped with tanks, armoured fighting vehicles, rocket artillery and short-range ballistic missiles. We and our allies have legitimate and real cause for concern that the configuration and scale of the force being assembled, supported by Russian air and maritime long-range strike capabilities stationed in the region, could be used for the purpose of conducting a multi-axis invasion of Ukraine. But whatever final decision the Russian government takes on the use of such forces, their presence and levels of readiness are contributing to a destabilising and coercive atmosphere that risks miscalculation at best and at worst, conflict. Furthermore, in recent weeks, we have observed hardening Russian rhetoric, heightened cyber activity, and widespread disinformation that could serve to provide false pretext for a Russian military intervention. False narratives are very much part of the Kremlin's playbook. They were used in 2008 before Russia's invasion of Georgia and in Ukraine in 2014. False narratives are being peddled again today. Russia has suggested that their military build-up on the border of Ukraine is in response to NATO aggression and an agenda by the West to use Ukraine to divide and rule the Russian nation. They have put forward this outlandish notion that NATO is attempting to encircle Russia. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, no one is trying to rule the Russian nation. Only 1/16 of Russia shares a border with a NATO ally, and NATO is and always has been a defensive alliance. NATO at its core holds the belief that any country in the alliance, no matter how big or how small they are, is by right of membership owed a pledge of mutual defence. You attack one of us, you attack us all. From 12 founding countries in 1949, the NATO alliance has grown to a total of 30 today. These countries have joined the alliance not because NATO is making them do so, but because of the freely expressed will of the government and peoples of those countries. Countries choose NATO. NATO does not choose them. If Russia has concerns about the enlargement, it should perhaps ask itself why, when people were free to choose, they chose NATO. NATO is an alliance of like-minded nations who, as well as sharing a commitment to mutual defence, also set a share of common values, and sovereignty of other nations is respected by all. Each nation has a sovereign right to choose its own security arrangement. This is a fundamental principle of European security, one indeed to which Russia has subscribed in the past, and yet now Russia seeks a veto over who joins NATO. The United Kingdom will stand up for the right of countries to choose their alliances. More important than the choice they make is the right to have that choice. On my recent visit to both Sweden and Finland, two non-NATO countries, it was clear that Kremlin attempts to dictate what sovereign states can or cannot choose has been rejected across the political spectrum. Mr. Speaker, I must stress, no one wants conflict. The Ukrainians are not seeking confrontation, despite the illegal annexation of their lands in Crimea and the occupation of Donbass. And I am sure ordinary Russian people who remember the first Chechnya conflict and other older conflicts don't want yet another quagmire either. Last week, there were intensive discussions on the international front to achieve a diplomatic solution to the current situation, including at NATO and the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Engagement at the NATO-Russia Council made it clear that NATO is open to dialogue with Russia on a range of issues to protect Euro-Atlantic security, including risk reduction, transparency, arms control, and lines of communication. But we will not reward aggression. And we are open to dialogue on a bilateral basis. On the 23rd of December, the Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Tony Radakin, spoke with his Russian counterpart, General Gerasimov. In their call, they agreed the vital importance of maintaining communications to understand each other's intentions and to avoid miscalculation. When the Prime Minister spoke to President Putin on the 13th of December, he expressed the United Kingdom's deep concern over the build-up of Russian forces on Ukraine's border and also reiterated the importance of working through diplomatic channels to de-escalate tensions and identify durable solutions. The Foreign Secretary continues to engage with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, including recently in person at the margins of the OSCE Ministerial Council in Stockholm on the 2nd of December. Russia has the largest conventional force of any single nation in Europe. It has a proud history. We have fought together. We celebrated the courage of the Arctic convoys at the 80th anniversary last year. And Russia is a nuclear power. It does not have anything to fear from NATO or Ukraine or the other countries that strive peacefully on the continent of Europe. So today I'm extending, Mr. Speaker, an invitation to my Russian counterpart, Sergei Shogoi, to visit London in the next few weeks. We are ready to discuss issues related to mutual security concerns and engage constructively in good faith. The UK's position on Ukraine, Mr. Speaker, is also clear. We unequivocally support its sovereignty and territorial integrity with its international recognised borders, including Crimea. Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country of proud, independent Ukrainian people. The UK Ministry of Defence already has a long-standing relationship with our Ukrainian counterparts, and we continue to provide support in many areas, including security assistance and defence reform. Since 2015, the UK has helped to build the resilience and capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces through Operation Orbital, which has trained over 22,000 Ukrainian troops. And we maintain the right to deliver bilateral support to a sovereign nation when requested in areas that will better help them defend themselves. It is important that Ukraine has the capability to defend itself. After Ukraine lost large parts of its navy to Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea, it became important to help Ukraine build up and sustain naval capability. And we should not forget, Mr. Speaker, the thousands of Ukrainians who have lost their lives defending their country and who every day are murdered by snipers from across the divide. That is why in 2019 I expanded Operation Orbital to include a naval cooperation. And that is why last year we agreed a range of measures, including supplying Ukraine with 2 mine countermeasure vessels, as well as agreeing the joint production of 8 new ships equipped with modern weapon systems, defensive weapon systems. And as I said in the House last week, the framework agreement presented to Parliament in November 2021 affirmed the principles that the UK will provide both training and defensive capabilities to Ukraine to help them better defend themselves. Within that same principle, I can today confirm to the House that in light of the increasingly threatening behaviour from Russia, and in addition to our current support, the UK is providing a new security assistance package to increase Ukraine's defensive capabilities. We have taken the decision to supply Ukraine with light anti-armour defensive weapon systems. A small number of UK personnel will provide early-stage training for a short period of time within the framework of Operation Orbital before returning to the United Kingdom. This security assistance package complements the training and capabilities that Ukraine already has, and those that are also being provided by the UK and other allies in Europe and the United States. Ukraine has every right to defend its borders, and this new package of aid further enhances its ability to do so. Let me be clear. This support are for short-range and clearly defensive weapon capabilities. They are not strategic weapons and pose no threat to Russia. They are to use in self-defence. And the UK personnel providing the early-stage training, as I've said, will return to the United Kingdom after completing it. The Prime Minister has been clear that any destabilising action by Russia in Ukraine would be a strategic mistake that would have significant consequences. That is why there is a package of international sanctions ready to go that will make sure that Russian government is punished if it crosses the line. But the cost of an invasion will not just be felt by the West. I visited Ukraine 5 times since 2016, and I know that the Ukrainian people are proud and will stand and fight for their country, for democracy and for freedom. Any invasion will not be viewed as a liberation, but as an occupation, and I fear it could lead to a huge loss of life on all sides. The current difficult relationship with the Kremlin is not the one we wish it to have in the United Kingdom. It does not have to be this way, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom respects the people, culture and history of Russia. We have more in common than we may think, culturally, historically and technologically. We wish to be friends with the Russian people, as we have been for hundreds of years. And there is a world in which we can establish a mutually beneficial relationship with Russia, working together on shared areas of interest and addressing mutual security concerns. The current gap is wide, but it is not unbridgeable. I still remain hopeful that diplomacy will prevail, Mr. Speaker. It is President Putin's choice whether to choose diplomacy and dialogue or conflict and the consequences. But Russia's current behaviour is not only threatening the sovereignty of a proud nation-state, it is also destabilising the rules-based international order and challenging the values that underpin it. That is why it's all the more important that we stand in solidarity with those who share our values, including our NATO allies and partners like Sweden, Finland and Ukraine.
Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his advanced sight of the statement?
Can I welcome its contents, and can I make clear Labour's full backing for the steps the government has been taking on international diplomatic efforts to de-escalate threats, on defensive support for the Ukraine military, on necessary institutional reforms within the country, and on tough economic and financial sanctions in response to any fresh Russian invasion into Ukraine. There is, Mr. Speaker, unified UK political support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including Crimea, in the face of escalating Russian aggression. And this bilateral UK backing, I have to say, is hugely appreciated in Ukraine, as I and the Shadow Foreign Secretary confirmed when we visited Kiev last week. 4 things were clear to us from our wide-ranging discussions, Mr. Speaker. First, this crisis is made in the Kremlin. Ukraine's independence and borders were guaranteed by Russia alongside the US and the UK in the 1994 Budapest Agreement, under which Ukraine also decommissioned its nuclear weapons, then making the whole of Europe much safer. What special role and responsibility does the Defence Secretary believe the UK still has as a guarantor of this agreement? Ukrainians warmly received recent visits from defence ministers as well as the Defence Secretary himself just before Christmas. When will the Foreign Secretary also visit Ukraine to underline the UK's strong continuing support? Second, Mr. Speaker, talking is better than fighting. And the international unity last week, especially at the NATO-Russia Council, is very important to Ukraine. Now, NATO, as the Defence Secretary has said, has acknowledged Russian security concerns. What are the areas it has offered as open to dialogue? And is any further international diplomacy scheduled with Russia? Third, Ukraine has faced active Russian aggression for many years. Russia's big military build-up on its borders now is part of the continuous attacks Ukraine has faced, as the highly destructive malware detected by Microsoft at the weekend in many government networks shows us and reminds us very strongly. So what role will the UK play in delivering the new cyber cooperation agreement that NATO and Ukraine have signed today, but the Defence Secretary hasn't mentioned in his statement? Fourth, the UK is a different country now than it was in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and Russian proxies seized parts of eastern Ukraine. 13,000 Ukrainian lives have been lost in fighting since then. Its military, its sense of identity, its resolve to resist Russia, and its determination to become a good European country, as Prime Minister Yatsenyuk put it to us, have all become much stronger. It is critical the Kremlin appreciates that any new military attack on Ukraine will be bloody on both sides. So what is the Defence Secretary doing to get across this important message on miscalculation to President Putin? When did he last meet his Russian counterpart? Turning finally, Mr. Speaker, to military support to Ukraine as a sovereign nation seeking to defend itself. The Shadow Foreign Secretary and I were told many times last week how highly Ukraine values UK military training and how frontline troops bring out their British Operation Orbital certificate when asked about the best help they've had. So we welcome the recent expansion of bilateral British support to naval cooperation, and we back the new delivery of defensive weaponry the Defence Secretary has announced this afternoon. But let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, this will be used by Russian propagandists as provocation. So can the Defence Secretary spell out clearly these are defensive anti-tank weapons with a much shorter range than the US Javelin missiles Ukraine has had for some time? And these are weapons that won't be used unless Russia invades. These are dangerous days for security in Europe. especially for the Ukrainian people. And even at this 11th hour, across this House, we deeply hope that diplomacy, sound judgment and respect for international law will prevail with President Putin.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Right Honourable Member and indeed the Labour front bench for their support and for the detailed engagement they have partaken with the Ukrainians. I know it has meant a huge amount to them to see a cross-party support for their rights, and I want to thank him personally for the efforts that he and the Shadow Foreign Secretary has gone to. These are difficult times and dangerous times, as he says. It is important to navigate the very thin path between provocation and defence of people who are clearly under threat and intimidation, and that whatever we do cannot be used by the Kremlin to exploit for their own narratives. And I have welcomed, continue to brief the opposition and indeed other members of this House to make sure that they are fully informed. I will try and answer some of his questions, Mr. Speaker. First of all, on the Budapest Memorandum, it is indeed one of the three main treaties that Russia is in breach of or not upholding. It was a fair deal. It was a deal done between the Ukrainians and Russia, and it is important that we remind Russia, first of all, through diplomatic channels, of those obligations, and I think it is a stark reminder that you can't pick and choose the treaties that you have signed up to. We believe that the subsequent Minsk Treaty and protocols is something that we would wish to support and wish Russia to engage in. It respects some of the concerns around the Donbass, and I hope that is one of the best paths towards securing a peaceful resolution. It does not seem at the moment that Russia is engaging enough on that, and I think that is definitely the treaty to look at. And of course it is underwritten by France, Germany and the United States through the Normandy format, and we would support the use of that. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, plans to visit Ukraine soon. I know I have spoken to her about it, and I think the office is just working out dates for her visit, and I think that is also important. On cyber, I will write in detail to the Right Honourable Gentleman about the NATO initiative. We have been supporting for a number of years now Ukraine with cyber defence, making sure its resilience is improved, taking the lessons we have here and sharing and working with them. That is why so useful is the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre, not only domestically but it's internationally recognised, and when the experts there come to give advice, it certainly helps with the resilience. On what can we do more of, I think one of the concerns that we have to address is Russia's sense of encirclement, as I said at the beginning, and a fear which is untrue and based on either a misconception or indeed a falsehood. And one of the ways is through better transparency. You know, we have had schemes such as the Open Skies schemes. We've had a number of treaties, some of which have been broken by Russia, which is unfortunate, but I certainly think that more transparency. We have often Vienna inspections in this country. We had some only the other month by Russian military personnel who came to visit an RAF base. That is one of the best ways to demonstrate the realities on the ground, that NATO is not an aggressor, that we are not planning some offensive, but I think definitely working more to deal with that and to also give Russia its voice. And I was delighted that we had the Russia-NATO Council, the first in 2 years, only a few weeks ago, because that is incredibly important, or last week actually, that we get to hear and meet face-to-face Russia. Myself, when it comes to my counterpart, I have not met my counterpart. Obviously, since the Salisbury poisoning, the relationships have been in a low ebb. It has also been the case that for many years, actually, the Russian Defence Secretary and the British Defence Secretary has not had periodic or routine meetings, and I think it's important that we offer that. Whether they will accept that, that is a different issue, and it is important that we reach out at the very least and have a discussion, because
to give each other the respect I think sovereign nations deserve. On weapon systems, I can concur with the right honourable gentleman. Absolutely, these are short range. They are not strategic, they are tactical. They are the sort of systems you use if someone is attacking you. It is at infantry level type weapon systems, but nevertheless it would make people pause and think what they were doing, and if tanks were to roll into Ukraine, invade it, then they would be part of the defensive mechanism.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I say thank you to the Defence Secretary for not only keeping this House informed, but I think working tirelessly behind the scenes to push NATO as much as it can, given the limits of that alliance. But talks in Brussels and indeed Geneva have reached their conclusion, or in conclusion. Cyber attacks have now commenced, and we now see Putin clearly intends to invade as part of his wider strategy to expand Moscow's sphere of influence and indeed help label and indeed retain NATO as the adversary that Russia must stand up to. But Russia has now amassed the land forces, the weapon systems and even the field hospitals to allow an invasion to take place. Could the Secretary of State say when these anti-armor weapon systems that he's providing will be operational in Ukraine? And also, does he believe that if Putin does give the green light to invade, what additional military support could NATO provide to offer to Ukraine to help thwart the Russian aggression east of the Dnipro River?
Look, I am grateful for my right honourable friend's comments. And look, there is still way to go. We still have NATO, we still have our alliances, we still have the international community in its efforts to try and find a diplomatic solution. And we will carry on doing that until the very last moment. And I hope, because I think President Putin has still not made a final decision, but I hope that that is enough to ward the Kremlin off. A united front on sanctions, which is what we are developing, prepared and ready if something were to happen. A strong resilience in Ukraine should, at the very least, give people a pause to thought. On the wider issues about those systems, the first systems were delivered today. In-country, and the training will take part. As I've said, they are not major strategic weapon systems, so therefore they are fairly simple, and the training package will therefore not be drawn out. And as I've said, the trainers will then return. But if Russia attacks militarily, the first and foremost response will be, as we've said, in the realms of sanctions and diplomacy, and indeed the consequences that President Putin would face as being a world leader and what could potentially be a very, very bloody and a war which is triggered by an invasion, which is neither within international law nor indeed is what anyone wants in this world. So I think, first of all, reputationally, economically, and then militarily, we will of course explore whatever we could in those realms. But as I've been clear previously, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and British troops will not be deploying to fight Russians.
I'm just going to help everyone. It's 6:30 is where I'm roundabout where I'm expecting this. So help each other by being quick, short in questions and answers. But we come first to Dave Dugan, the SNP spokesperson.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. We remain clear on these benches that Russia's actions in recent weeks and months, the massing of 100,000 combat-ready troops, tanks and heavy military equipment near Ukraine's eastern border, is unacceptable. In this, we are in accord with the government. The behaviour of Russia in causing this crisis is wholly inconsistent with the norms of state-based behaviours as regards matters of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is therefore incumbent on all of us to stand firm in the face of such threats to the international rules-based order and to stand behind our friends in Ukraine in the face of this aggression. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg your pardon. We can see from the tone and content of Russia's preconditions to de-escalate that there remains a major diplomatic challenge in resolving this crisis through dialogue, and yet this must remain the government's principal objective. Russia's demand that NATO withdraws troops and military equipment from countries neighbouring Russia, which of course includes not only Ukraine but our allies, our NATO allies in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, is clearly not designed to be acceded to. Nevertheless, I think it would be heartening for the Baltic states to hear the Secretary of State underline what an absurd proposition this demand is on NATO, that it will never happen, and that the bedrock of NATO as a defensive alliance remains the solidarity between its member states. Madam Deputy Speaker, I ask the Secretary of State, can he confirm what role the Russian Military Studies Centre at the Defence Academy in Shrivenham is having in informing the government's thinking in this crisis? And can he reassure the House that the work to deliver a peaceful and diplomatic outcome remains this government's main priority? And within that dynamic, what role does he believe negotiations over Nord Stream 2 has? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all, can I thank the honourable gentleman and his party for the support in the progress we make so far, and have been, their responsible response is, I think, very much to be welcome, and I will continue to brief their spokesperson as information comes to us. First of all, I think on solidarity with the Baltics, I'm off to Latvia tomorrow to visit the Baltics. As you can imagine, some of those states are absolutely some of the smallest in NATO, but right on the front line. And it is really important to get that message across that we are there to defend, big or small, in NATO, and those countries that share our values. It is also important, I think, to remind even their neighbouring states, such as Finland, that the right to choose is more important even than the membership of NATO, of what they choose. I would defend Sweden and Finland's right to choose. If they choose not to go to NATO, then that is their choice. But we should never take away the choice, which is, I think, what's so unreasonable about the Kremlin's demand, that somehow countries between the United States and themselves don't get to have a say of their own sovereignty, and I think that is incredibly wrong. We are all working for a peaceful outcome, and no one wants to conflict to happen. We think the conflict would be long and bloody, and I think it is very important we also recognise that there is another thinking in the Kremlin. We can engage on the NATO debate, Madam Speaker, but if I point honourable and right honourable members in the House to the article written by President Putin in July, of 17 pages, NATO appears in one paragraph. What it really is about is ethno-nationalism and a sense of reuniting a mother Russia that didn't really quite exist, and indeed picking dates to fit the narrative. That is written by the President of Russia. That should concern us all. I've read those type of articles before in other areas, and it leads to usually the most awful of bloodshed.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that, as well as helping Ukraine militarily, we need to constantly make clear to President Putin that his very concept of a Russian near abroad, the veto over the security and foreign policies of his geographic neighbours, is at odds with international law and completely at odds with the concept of self-determination? And does he agree that what we are witnessing now is a classic example of the KGB doctrine of reflexive control, which is all too often a precursor to Russian military action?
Secretary of State.
I think what we are saying, as the United States said, is the playbook, Madam Deputy Speaker. Narratives, cyber attacks, disruption of minorities, division, all preyed upon that country. But I also think there is something else, which is what is the consequences of a successful military invasion in Ukraine for the rest of Europe. Last week I visited Sweden and Finland, when countries like that are genuinely concerned and worried by their neighbours, a proper, strong European countries, not members of NATO, are worried. We should sit up and listen, all of us in Europe, because the consequence after a Ukrainian invasion, if that was to be successful, is what else for the other ambitions of the President?
Kevan Jones.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and commend him on his article in this morning's Times, which laid out clearly the false narrative which President Putin is using to justify his actions against the Ukraine. Can I ask what more can be done in the information war? And will he specifically back an initiative by Congressman Jerry Collins, the President of the NATO PA, who's calling for a Centre for Democracy within NATO to actually argue the case and the reason for why freedom of thought and actions are so important?
Secretary of State.
On the latter, I would definitely support NATO going out and about, and indeed NATO members, and supporting not only the values that we stand for, but also my point about the right to choose even if you don't choose NATO. I think we've forgotten about what we often argue for. We have given up often, we've taken for granted our values and the cost of freedom around the world, and we must never stop arguing for it and making the case. And too often over the decades it's been too easy to stop making that case or indeed trade off against an economic issue. And I think that's why Nord Stream is important, that we recognise Nord Stream 2 as a success is not going to be a success for Europe. It will increase friction and division, and we should press on our German friends to do more. It should Russia invade Ukraine.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I very much welcome my right honourable friend's statement and indeed the support across the House for the Ukrainian people. It's quite true that a free people chooses freedom, and the Ukrainian people are trying to do just that. Would my right honourable friend care to mention other failures of the Putin strategy, turning friends and allies, former friends of allies of Russia, against them? Isn't this an extraordinarily sad day for the Russian people, who have been so abused by this tyrannical dictatorship under Putin that even countries that have had such strong relationships with them, like the Ukrainian people, are now seeking assistance from us to make sure that their homes are not violated by Russian troops?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend makes a really important point. If the aim of President Putin is to de-escalate or indeed push back NATO from his borders, then he should reflect on why so many people have wanted to join NATO, which is predominantly a consequence of his actions, whether that is in Georgia, whether that is in Crimea, or indeed the sub-threshold actions that is putting real fear into countries like Sweden and Finland. And it is no coincidence that in both the Finnish and Swedish parliaments, a sense of being closer to NATO than they have in the past is growing. That is not because of NATO, there's no secret plot, it is because of the actions of the President of Russia.
Chris Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Defence Secretary is absolutely right. When Putin talks of trying to bring together ethnic Russians into the motherland, it does remind one of the 1930s when Hitler referred to trying to bring all Germans, including Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia, back into Mother Germany. So, of course, we're right to be very cautious. Can I just ask him, when he says he's offered this invitation to his Russian counterpart, I hope that doesn't mean that we are announcing that we are normalising our political relations with Russia, because the all-party parliamentary group on Russia has been very keen to make sure, as has the House and the IPU, that we are not normalising our political relationships until such time as Russia is able to hand over the evidence that is clearly needed in relation to Salisbury.
Secretary of State.
The right honourable member is absolutely right on his last point. You know, I was the security minister when Salisbury happened. This is not about normalising relations, but this is about opening a line of dialogue so we can hopefully address a range of issues. You know, the GRU belonged to the Russian Ministry of Defence, and it is important. You know, I will not be forgetting that in any way, but I don't fear anything by engaging with my counterpart. And on his point of ethnic nationalism, you know, it is something that in the UK is really against our DNA. Because of the lessons we have seen over hundreds of years, and I think you know, people would be wise not to believe that that article that the President wrote is the right course of action. The course of action is through dialogue and addressing the here and now, not harking back to snippets of history.
To Julian Lewis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Mr. Putin knows that NATO will not start World War III to defend Ukraine. But has he been made aware of precisely what non-military sanctions will follow? For example, is Finland or Sweden likely to proceed with an application to join NATO, as has been suggested?
Secretary of State.
First of all, there is a sort of basket of sanctions that are prepared both by the United Kingdom and the United States, and indeed the EU are addressing and formulating a package. Within that, obviously, Sweden and Finland would be part of that. Look, I can't speak for Finland and Sweden whether they would join NATO. The fundamentals of NATO is the open door policy. We've been very clear on that. But also, you know, as I've said, I am even more clear that the defending a country to choose is actually more important than often what they choose. And, you know, I think we enhance and work our relationship with Finland and Sweden through the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which are 11 nations of Scandinavia, Nordic and Britain, working together, exercising together in the defence world. That's brilliant. That binds together EU, NATO and other members together to make sure that we can deter by being as professional as possible as our armed forces.
Cleary Ben.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the recent negotiations, NATO rightly rejected the wholly unreasonable demands of Russia for the reasons that the Secretary of State has so clearly set out to the House, but did indicate that it would be willing to talk about other matters. Does the government support, for example, putting arms control and limits to military exercises on the table in any further discussions?
Secretary of State.
I think, in response to the right honourable gentleman, certainly when it comes to arms control, we've always felt arms control are good things. I'm old enough to remember the 1980s and the work that people went into to get those, and it's been sad that Russia has breached a number of those treaties. The United States pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty not so long ago, and I think we should try and work towards getting back to a place where we can have more confidence in each other, first and foremost. Look, on exercising, first of all, NATO should exercise in order to keep itself at the best it can be for defence. I think it is also for the right of a sovereign country to choose to exercise in its land. If Lithuania and Estonia wishes to exercise militarily, either bilaterally or multilaterally, that is a choice for that country, and we are always happy to work together. I'm not sure I want to give Russia a veto over where we exercise, but I am very supportive of making sure we're as open as possible so that people don't miscalculate when we do exercise and they recognise it is an exercise rather than an operation.
Seeley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, like him, I read President Putin's essay on the historical unity of the Russians and the Ukrainians this summer. In it, he clearly doesn't recognise Ukraine in its current borders, but in it he also lays out what he thinks are justifiably Russian lands, the oblasts, the counties that run along the north side of the Black Sea, linking Rostov with Transnistria and Odessa. Is that the same thinking that he got from reading that same article?
My honourable friend is right. His article even goes further and talks about the Corinthian ruse, which is part of the Czech Republic. The other bit that I think was deeply sad about the article was anyone that disagreed was effectively described as Russophobic. I cannot tell you how wrong that is. It is perfectly possible to disagree with the Kremlin and the actions of President Putin without disagreeing with the people of Russia or indeed supporting Russia. I am a proud Scot. The Scots and the Russians almost spent most of their time in each other's courts. There were admirals, there were generals, there were physicians. 150 years of Scottish-Russian links helped build the Russian medical system that we know today. And I think that's the worst part of his article, is that to criticise is to be anti-Russian, which is quite wrong.
Jamie Stone.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Norwegian Prime Minister has recently spoken about Russia increasing hybrid operations, including cyber attacks and signal jamming. I compliment the Secretary of State for his visits last week, but clearly one of our great allies is Norway. Can the Secretary of State outline to me what specific steps are being taken during the Ukraine crisis to ensure that in no way Norway's security is compromised?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman will know that Britain and Norway are really, really old allies and indeed almost can see each other from his constituency. And I was there as well after Finland and Sweden last week. So first of all, we exercise regularly at all levels in all areas. Both our intelligence relationship and our military relationship is strong. The Royal Marines have been present in the High North for decades, really, and we were planning even more exercising to do together. Norway also plays a really key role in bringing alongside a NATO country, Finland and Sweden, so the exercise in the Arctic and the High North, which is of course a growing domain and indeed an area where Russia can use sub-threshold activity, everything from migrant flows. There was a period in their history where they put migrants on bicycles. They gave them free bicycles to drive them across the border not so long ago. And I think it's really important that we work together to have the shared understanding and to say to Russia the same messaging in that part of the world is that, you know, we are all one people. Our links go across for centuries, but also understanding what they're up to is as important.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Defence Secretary's statement today? He will know that in 2014, Russian aggression severely degraded the Ukrainian Navy. Could he update the House on the Ukrainian Capabilities Enhancement Project? What progress has been made since that was signed in June?
State.
As my right honourable friend will know, the Ukrainian Navy effectively was snatched in the invasion of Crimea, which was one of the main Navy bases, and they have been operating predominantly on gifts from the United States of patrol boats, which is why we entered into an agreement last year to help them build boats to allow them to protect their coastline, and indeed infrastructure investment in their ports to start rebuilding a navy. The breadbasket of Europe, it is important that Ukraine has that ability to export and free navigation. We've already seen Russia threaten that, and we saw the aggressive action towards HMS Defender earlier in the year, and it's really important that we help them help themselves.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While it's important that we take Russian security worries seriously, we must resist at all costs any attempt by Russia to re-imperialise Eastern Europe. So can I push the Secretary of State on two dimensions of his twin-track strategy? First, how ready is NATO to accede to requests to join from Finland, but also from countries in the Western Balkans and Georgia, so that any tactical advance into the Ukraine is a strategic defeat? But second, could the Secretary of State say a word about the INF Treaty? Because it's hard to see an arms control framework for Europe without some kind of measure of control over ground-launched cruise missiles, even if they're non-nuclear, on the continent of Europe.
Secretary of State.
On the